can start.
Okay. Good evening and welcome to day 4 of the Tamil Heritage Trust Indology Festival 2023. Before we begin the day's program, we will do a quick introduction of the trust and the program so far. Tamil Heritage Trust, established in 2010, has been performing several activities and doing a lot of work in the field of India's cultural heritage. We conduct several programs, starting with the monthly heritage talks, held 2 times every month, on the first Saturday in English and the third Saturday, which is a talk in Tamil. We also do our annual themed seminars called the Pechu Kacheri, held in the month of December. These are themed seminars that are held over a period of 2 days. We also conduct heritage appreciation workshops for the general public, including temple appreciation, museum appreciation, Pallava Grantham workshop, and so on. We also do annual site seminars, which are essentially trips to cultural sites, heritage sites around India. Through our program called Alamar Avai, we engage with the teachers in Tamil Nadu and help them become better ambassadors of heritage within the schools that they function. We also host awards. The V. Venkaya Epigraphy Award 2022 was awarded to Dr. Y. Subrailu, who is going to be a speaker in this event 2 days from now. So this award was hosted by Tamil Heritage Trust and was instituted by the family of Sri V. Venkaya, the late epigraphist. We also institute the Tamil Heritage Trust Professor S. Swaminathan Award, which is awarded to individuals who do exceptional work in the field of Indian heritage. If you wish to be part of our programs, if you wish to receive notifications of our programs, you may do so by sending us an email, admin@tamilheritage.in. All our programs are available on YouTube. So you can go on to YouTube, type Tamil Heritage Trust and click on subscribe, and you should receive notification of all our programs. This is our 3rd Indology Festival. We held the inaugural edition in 2020 and the 2nd edition in 2022. Our 2nd edition was around the medieval India and its temple builders. So we picked several dynasties that ruled India between the 8th and 13th century CE, and we spoke about the art that they have contributed to, the temples and monuments that they built. This is our 3rd edition, and Sagara Sangamam, we are celebrating the maritime connection and history of India. India has a long tradition and history with the sea, and there are several aspects that India has been influenced because of the sea and its maritime connection, and that is what we are focusing on in this Sagara Sangamam Indology Festival. We have a 7-day program. Today is day 4, where we have 14 scholars talking to us about various aspects of maritime history, the trade, the merchants, the epigraphical evidence, the maritime archaeology, the politics, the spread of religion, and so on. On day 1, we had Dr. Himanshu Prabhare delivering the keynote address commemorating India's maritime history. Following that, Dr. K.R.A. Narsaya spoke about the Indian connection with world maritime history. On day 2, Dr. Yadubir Singh Rawat gave a lecture on the Harappan coastal settlements, and followed by that, Dr. Chaya Goswami spoke about the merchants of the Kachi merchants in Arabia and East Africa. Yesterday, day 3, we had Dr. Selva Kumar from the Tamil University, Tanjavur, speak to us about the ships and watercraft in ancient and medieval India. Following that, Dr. Pius spoke about the maritime history of Malabar. So with that, welcome to day 4. First up, we have Swati Chemburkar, who's an architectural historian and whose work focuses on Southeast Asia, especially Cambodia. She has been part of the Southeast Asian Art Academic Program, SAAAP, at SOAS London University since 2016. She directed a postgraduate diploma course on Southeast Asian art and architecture at Jnana Prawaha, Mumbai, for about 10 years. She is the editor of Art of Cambodia, Interactions with Cambodia, March 2016. Some of her recent publications include Khmer Empire and Southeast Asia, Pratnya Paramita and Khmer esoteric Buddhism in the 10th to 13th centuries, dancers, musicians, ascetics, and priests, performance-based Saiva worship and its development in the temple cults of Angkor, libraries or fire shrines, reinterpreting the function of annex buildings in Khmer Saiva temples from the prism of early Saivism. This talk by Swati Chemburkar traces the spread of the Saiva networks. Like I said, we are talking about different aspects of maritime history. Today's talk will focus on, or this talk will focus on the Saiva networks across maritime Asia, and it will specifically focus on the Pasupata Saivam and the Pasupata Saivam sect's involvement in the Khmer temple building in Cambodia. With those few words, we welcome Swati Chemburkar to deliver her lecture.
Many thanks to team THT for inviting me to present my research, but a bigger thank you to organizing a conference on such a current topic. Really appreciate that. I've been listening to quite a few talks since last couple of days. Most of them are India-centric. I mean, of course, it's India and the sea. But I come from Cambodia, so I look at India from Gulf of Thailand and South China Sea. So my presentation would be slightly different than the other ones. I'll start sharing this screen. Yeah. So what you see here is a photograph of one of the temples from very early site of Cambodia. And on the top, above the niche, you see a Gavak sort of a motif. Inside that is a puja or a ritual of linga. In the center, you see a linga and the worshippers worshipping the linga. Now, the study of Cambodian civilization from, say, 6th century onwards has predominantly taken India-centric viewpoint. The early French scholarship, which was written during the colonial period, called the broad dissemination of Indic culture and philosophy ideas as Indianization of Southeast Asia, which was then followed by the Indian scholars calling the whole area as Greater India or India beyond Ganges. Now, with the emergence of independent nation states in Southeast Asia, the focus on Indianization was obviously resented, and the scholarship then turned towards the ideas such as cultural connections, connected world, shared histories or heritage, Monsoon Asia, Sanskrit cosmopolis, Buddhist cosmopolis, or borderless geography, India and indigenous, or local versus cosmopolitan. But as you'll see during the presentation, the local was already cosmopolitan. Most of these studies were still focused, in spite of different names, were still focused on the idea of center, which was of course India, and the periphery, which was Southeast Asia. And the ideas traveled from center to periphery. But in fact, last couple of years, quite a few genetic studies which are coming out are, they propose that Austroasiatic speakers in India, today we have, who were derived from dispersal of Southeast Asians, and then followed obviously by the extensive sex-specific admixtures with local Indian population. Now on the map, the orange, yellow-orange patches you see are the patches of Austroasiatic speakers. In Southeast Asia, the languages of Austroasiatic speakers are Thai, Khmer, or Vietnamese. But in India, you have the languages such as Munda, Santali, Khasi, Nicobaris, and these are the states where you find all these tribes which I have listed on the left-hand side. Now, these genetic studies, the Austroasian languages, which is a bigger area, greener area, which are basically Javanese, Sundanese, Malay, and so on. Now, these genetic studies are a little difficult to follow. They're extremely technical, talking about mtDNA or, very specific genes and all that. So unless you have a technical background, it's little difficult to understand these studies. But what these studies suggest, that around the time the Harappan civilization was sort of beginning to crumble in northwestern India, there was an influx of people coming through Eastern India. There was an influx of Southeast Asians coming through Eastern India. So the question here is whether India was really purely Indic even during that time. So another important work on the subject has been done by Himanshu Prabha Ray, who talked on the first day. Her first book, which came, I think, around 20 years ago, 93 or 94, I don't remember the publication year, but it was Winds of Change, Buddhism and the Maritime Links of Early South Asia. And it was a very important as well as pioneering work in a time when most of the Indian scholars still viewed Southeast Asia as Greater India. So around that time, she really carried out a thorough investigation into the field of Southeast Asian archaeology, resulting into a very balanced approach towards Indianization. Her most recent work, Coastal Shrines, that she talked about on day one, explores the entire maritime landscape, which is lined with coastal shrines, sometimes even inland shrines. But she looks at these shrines and communication between these shrines through various agencies, such as fishing communities or traders or traveling merchants, monks, artistic guilds, and so on. She never really traces about a shrine being Vietnamese or Cambodian or Javanese or Indian. She also doesn't really differentiate as the shrine being Hindu or Buddhist. So the work is important because it goes beyond the religious boundaries or the geographical boundaries and looks at the whole landscape of these shrines. The other important recent publication are the 2 volumes edited by Andrea Akri and Peter Sharrock. Andrea is going to talk about possibly some of the aspects of these publications tomorrow. It focuses on the active role played by Southeast Asian kingdoms as innovators and creators. And these volumes actually question the whole center and periphery model and highlights how the periphery actually actively played the role of creator and sometimes even became a center. So, for example, the earliest depictions of Karanas, which are mentioned in Natya Shastra, 108 Karanas, which are the transition in the classical Indian dance, like you transit from one pose to another, are called Karanas, which are described in Natya Shastra. But the earliest depiction of these Karanas, Karana reliefs, are found not in India, but they are found in Java, in Indonesia, on the Shiva temple of Prambanan, which is almost 100 or 200 years older than the reliefs you find on Brihadeshwara or Chidambaram temple in Tanjore. Similarly, a purely monastic deity, a very wrathful or fierce deity such as Heruka or Hivajra that you find in Indian monasteries of Nalanda or Ratnagiri in Odisha, they become royal deities. Hivajra becomes really royal deity in Cambodia or even in Java. So, you have to look at these kind of things. So following the same line of thought, I'm interested in knowing how movements of ascetics, religious gurus, or even religious philosophies travel across sea or circulating around the maritime area, and how they played influential role in development of art and architecture. More interestingly, even when the same texts or similar ideologies are circulating, why certain elements are picked up by say Khmers, and why certain elements were picked up by say Indians, and how this helps us in understanding of a religious school or of a religious movement, and in this case, Shaivism or Pasupata Saivism. So this is a late 15th century map of Southeast Asia, drawn by a German geographer and mathematician, Münster, who based this map on 2nd century geographer Ptolemy's map. Now, a very obvious thing is 50% area in the map is blue, which is sea. On the right-hand side, I've highlighted the Southeast Asia part, which is a modern boundary, and just superimposed it with this map just to get the idea. It's not always easy to find the locations or places mentioned in this map with the modern names. But there are 3 blue dots. One is Takola, which has been mentioned in Indian, Chinese, and Arabic sources right from 5th century, and it continues till 12th century. So clearly it was some very important port or place in Southeast Asia. The lowermost blue dot here is Sabara, which is probably Singapore. And this dot, it's not concludingly, it's concluded yet, but possibly the earliest port that of Ok Eo in the Mekong Delta. Now, along with the sea, what you see is river network. There were so many rivers which flowed into the sea, and that also played a major role in the whole maritime. Now, one of the early polities of Funan, the yellow patch that you see in the southern Cambodia and Vietnam, from 2nd century to 6th century is Funan. We get to know of Funan from the Chinese sources. Now, Chinese sources mention a polity in the lower Mekong Delta as Funan. And this polity, the Chinese mission was sent to this polity in early 3rd century to promote trade. So the early sites of Funan are we find in southern Vietnam and southern Cambodia. Possibly Angkor Borai, as you see, was the capital of Funan, and Ok Eo was a major port, which I showed you in the earlier slide, probably known to Romans as Kattigara or Kirtinagara. Now, the Chinese also record that a party traveled from Funan to Kushana, India, and returned with representative of the royal court of from this Kushana area in the 3rd century. In Funan, this whole envoy met up with the Chinese envoy. And the Chinese talk about the representatives coming from Murunda Kingdom. The best possible option for its location is Kushana, India, Murunda Kingdom. And they came with 4 horses. Now, we know that horse trade was very, very important. And Indian horses were very much in demand. In fact, we do know that a South Indian king, I don't remember the name of the ruler, but had sent a gift of horses to China. So we know that how horses were important, and there was a travel of horses. Now, most of the early temple sites are located in southern Cambodia, the Funanese temple sites. And then around 6th century onwards, a name appears in Chinese sources as Zhenla. Along with this name, you start encountering terms in Khmer inscriptions such as Indrapura, Bhavapura, Sreshtapura, Shambhupura, and so on. So Zhenla possibly comprised of these smaller or number of urbanized centers. Would have been Jengla. Now, the early Brahmanical sculpture Yeah, so the early Brahmanical sculpture from Funan is mostly Vaishnavite. So you see images of Vishnu, four-armed Vishnu, two-armed Vishnu, with a correct iconography, but he looks very Khmer. Also, you have inscriptions from Funan period, so which is 2 to 6th century CE, Vaishnavite inscriptions mentioning temples such as Chakratirtha Swami, containing the feet of Vishnu, Vishnupada, or hermitage being dedicated to Vishnu. Now, the earliest known anthropomorphic images are mostly Vaishnavite, as you see, and they all are from Funan. But as Zhenla begins to appear in the Chinese records, Saiva foundations mushroom. So what happens, the lower area, the southern area of Cambodia, which is the Funan kingdom, you have most of the Vishnuite foundations or Vishnuite shrines placed near the coast. But as the polity moves inward, I mean inside Zhenla, you start having mostly exclusively Shaiva foundations. And most of these Shaiva foundations depict the phallic form of Shiva. So it's Linga. As far as my knowledge goes, there is probably only one anthropomorphic Shiva image before 9th century. Otherwise, all the Shiva images are either in the form of Linga, or he's depicted on the right half of Harihara as Shiva, as you see the middle head, or Shiva is depicted as an ascetic. But there are no real anthropomorphic images around this time. Now, as I said, the Zhenla, it moves inwards in the central Cambodia, which is probably in the site of today's Sambor Praikuk, and the capital would have been Ishanapura. So what I've done on the left-hand side, you see Tonle Sap. This is the river, Stung Sen, and this blue dot is the site of Sambor Praikuk, identified as the capital. Sambor Praikuk is the modern name. Sambor means richness, Prai means forest, and Kuk is a temple. So it's the temple in the richness of forest. That's the modern name. The earlier name is Ishanapura, Ishanavarman's capital. So it's Ishanapura of Ishanavarman. So around 7th century, Zhenla kingdom, even in the Khmer epigraphy, you start encountering the word Ishanapura is mentioned. It's also mentioned in the Chinese records. Now, by far, this is the most extensive pre-Angkorian site. By pre-Angkor, I mean before 9th century Cambodia. And it comprises of 3 main groups. So on this side, you see, these are the 3 main temple groups, north, south, and central group. And now with the more and more excavations, there are more groups have been found. So the whole site is arranged as a sacred precinct and the profane. So you have a moated area here. Inside the moated area, you have a residential area, some shrines, but largely this is the temple zone. Now, the earlier French architect who was working on the site, Henri Parmentier, he documented around 70 plus structures, 70 plus shrines. But since 2007, a Japanese scholar called Ichita Shimoda has been working on the Sambor Praikuk Conservation Project. And so far, more than 300 shrines have come to light. This is really huge. The site is around 400 hectares. It's really spread out. Mostly, majority construction at Sambor Praikuk is brick with very little sandstone used for either door lintels or door jambs, or that's it. Just one structure, one stone structure is there, and which I'll talk about as we go on. Now, on this side, you see these two blue lines, which are the remains of the almost 2-kilometer long causeway that you see in the blue, which would have, I mean, as you know, as you see, the site is not really on the banks of the river Stungsen, it's slightly inside. So this 2-kilometer long causeway would have stretched till the port and connected to the Stungsen River, which really then flows into Mekong. So that would have been, connected to the Mekong, would have ensured the free passages of ships. As you know, you see the quote from Shimoda, it talks about how the grand entrance it would have had, the whole area, and how it would have welcomed, the people from the port. Now, given the connections of Ishanapura with the outside world through the port area, that easy access to the port would have made it a multi-ethnic society. And you do encounter non-Khmer names in the epigraphy of Ishanapura. Ishanapura also maintained relationships with the neighboring kingdoms. The envoy was sent to China around 7th century or so. Then the royal connections were also established through marriage alliances with the neighboring Champa kingdom, which is in present-day Vietnam. And it was also known in India. Indians knew about Ishanapura because when the Chinese Buddhist monk Xuanzang, when he traveled to India in 7th century, he had heard of Ishanapura. In his record, he talks about Ishanapura. He talks about many other places in Southeast Asia, like Sri Kshetra in Myanmar, Dwaravati in Thailand. He talks about Ishanapura. He also mentions that I have never visited these areas, but I have always heard about the people of Ishanapura or the practices or customs that they follow through other travelers in India. So he does talk about Ishanapura. The epigraphy also mentions Indian Brahmins arriving from parts of India and accepting Khmer daughters. Now, several pre-Angkorian inscriptions do mention places such as Dakshina Path, probably Deccan, Madhya Desha, Arya Desha, Mathura, Malwa, Kanchi, Kanchipura, thus revealing the long-distance relationship of Ishanapura rulers that, with different courts across Vietnam, China, and India. Some of the places which are mentioned in the records are surely Indian. For Madhya Desha, for example, there are debates about where exactly this place was. Around 7th century, when Shaivism becomes quite dominant at Ishanapura, it also sees the influx of new ideas, and the ancient Shaivite school, Pashupatas, the first time appears in Cambodia. Now, Pashupatas were viewed with some skepticism among Vedic Brahmins in India, as they deviated from Brahmanical norms in several ways, because they were devoted to Shiva and only Shiva, instead of, worshipping multitude of deities. They also showed disregard for the ritual significance of caste or purity. They didn't really believe in caste, which was defined by Brahmin orthodoxy. And this might explain their initial presence in 7th century Cambodia, because they wouldn't have bothered about the restrictions on the sea travels, which are mentioned in Dharma Shastras. As I said, Vaishnavism and Shaivism were both practiced in pre-Angkor Cambodia, so Cambodia before 9th century, also Buddhism, but especially Shaivism and Vaishnavism, both were tied to notions of kingship. But I think Shiva is more intimately tied to Khmer kingship, because there are quite a few inscriptions that talk about, especially the Ishanpura inscription. And I sometimes use Ishanpura or Sambor Praikuk. It's one and the same. The modern name is Sambor Praikuk. But the inscriptions of Ishanpura do praise Ishanavarman and emphasize the nature of Ishanavarman in the same manner as the Shiva Prahasiteshwara. So the inscription, describes Shiva and Ishanavarman as victorious, or they compare them both as masters of the earth. So we know how intimately the notions of kingship were connected with the Khmer Shaivism. Now, according to Paul Moose, it was very easy for Shaivism to mold into the tradition of, earlier ancestral or territorial cults, whether in India or in Southeast Asia. So, for example, mountains were already worshipped in Cambodia. So, with the spread of Shaivism, they became Shiva's abode, or the fertility cults which were presented in the rough stones were replaced by Shivalingas. And this is similar thing happened even in India. It was very, very easy for Shaivism to kind of assimilate into the indigenous territorial cults. Now, majority remains, as I said, of Sambor Praikuk or the Ishanapura kingdom are Shaiva shrines. Almost 90 Indic gods are mentioned in the pre-Angkorian inscriptions, out of which almost 50 are Shiva's epithets, and rest of them, of course, you have Vishnuite deities, then some Buddhist deities, and so on. So you have many linga installations as Shiva Bhadreshwara or Shiva Prahasiteshwara, Gambhireshwara, Ishaneshwara, and so on. Some scholars look at it as the recreation of Shiva's land in Cambodia. But some scholars think that it was, instead of recreation of Indic land of Shiva in the Khmer territory, it was the expansion of Shiva landscape, which kind of marks the process of creating Shiva land in Khmer domain in a very uniquely Khmer style. And the principal agent for this expansion seemed to be the missionary Shiva sect of Pashupatas, who originated in northern India in sometime in the 1st century. Now, these are some of the inscriptions from Sambor Praikuk, very early inscription. I have highlighted the Pashupata word because these are all really Pashupata inscriptions, which mention the erection of linga by Brahmin Pashupata named Vidya Vishesha. Or another inscription says at the, one of the temple sites, how a Pashupata Acharya called Vidya Pushpa established an ashram for his sect using the donations made by the king. Now, typically, Pashupata name begins with Vidya, and as you see in the inscription, most of them are with Vidya, Vidya Pushpa, Vidya Vishesha, Vidya Acharya, and so on, or they start with the Bhava. So you will have Pashupata ascetics named as Bhava Tejas, Bhava Shuddha, Bhava Sarvajna, and so on. Now, some of the inscriptions which do not specifically mention Pashupatas, but sometimes describe the practices, asceticism, or Shaivite devotionalism in a way that we know that these are Pashupata related practices. Also, before Ishanapura, as I said, the polity which was there in the lower Mekong called Funan, worshipped the deity as Maheshwara, and Maheshwara would have been precursors to Pashupatas, as argued by some of the scholars who work on Pashupata Shaivism. Now, Pashupatas became really prominent in Deccan, which are parts of Maharashtra, Karnataka, Andhra, around 7th century. and then started moving or spreading towards southeast. In Nepal, you have Pashupatinath temple, the very famous temple, or in Odisha, many of the temples in Bhubaneswar are Pashupata temples. In Bengal, then, it spread to towards Tamil Nadu, and then further south and Southeast Asia from 4th century onwards. The sect actively propagated its religious beliefs, converting Indian as well as Southeast Asian royalty. They promised the political success to the kings through the performance of certain rituals or certain ascetic practices on behalf of the king. Now, the epigraphic studies of Ishanapura rulers support Pashupatas, as we have seen. I just shown you the table. But they also played a very important role in Khmer royal courts. And that's how they obtained the confidence of kings. They offered initiations to the king, they offered intellectual services to the king, and in return, they received massive gifts, gifts of gold, land, parasols, and so on. The importance of asceticism among the Khmer kings is attested in various inscriptions. So you come across inscriptions where, the king's power or leadership is dependent on his ascetic efforts or devotion to Shiva, or sometimes the inscriptions mention as how the king takes pleasure in the company of sages, or how the king has possessed unshakable self-control sheerly through his ascetic practices. Now, despite the absence of anthropomorphic Shiva images in early Khmer art, the ascetic nature of Shiva is indicated through the sculptures of Harihara. The other side, the Shiva side of Harihara, really brings out the ascetic aspect of Shiva. So if you look at this Harihara image from Ashram Maharosai, obviously the ascetic hairstyle is seen, but here you see a tiger head, a tiger skin, upon which Shiva is said to have meditated. Now, on the left-hand side, there are two very famous lintels from Sambor Praikuk temples. The top one, you see a group of men sort of pouring. They are holding two pots and pouring something on the king. The king is seated in the center. And they are bearded, and they also have a sacred thread. So they are identified as Brahmins. They are performing what would be like a consecration ritual for the king. King is seated directly below the Shivalinga. Here is the Shivalinga. So, and then there at the end, at these two corners, you see musicians and dancers accompanying these Brahmins. On the top portion is the Lingodbhava Murti. You see the linga, and on both sides it's Brahma and Vishnu. I'm not very sure whether it's very clear, but on one side it's Brahma and Vishnu, and the center it's the linga. It narrates, the Lingodbhava myth narrates the supremacy of the linga. So the whole lintel, it has two meanings. I mean, on one side it's the Lingodbhava myth, but there is an intended message, and the message is very clear that the newly consecrated king will rule with the authority of Shiva, which is invoked during the consecration ritual. Now, given the importance of linga worship and the early period, and taking into account all the inscriptional records, these ascetics would be Pashupata Brahmins who are, performing these rituals on the king. The lower one is also from Sambur Praikuk, and you see long head. Sometimes you see the ascetics with the top knot. Again, they are depicted on a lintel, performing, seems like a ritual. They carry the musical instruments. And they are wearing simple dhotis. Sacred thread is there. Sometimes it's seen, like it's here, he's wearing a sacred thread. They're playing instruments and dancing ecstatically in celebration. Now there are some reasons why Pashupatas became so popular in South or across India and Southeast Asia. Because it didn't really believe in the caste system, but also the religion was open to both ascetics as well as the lay people. Not all Pashupatas were abided by the strict ascetic practices, which are prescribed in the text, but some surely served the needs of a larger Shaiva community as priests or acharyas. There weren't any restrictions on married people as well as others to practice this kind of Shaivism. Anyone devoted to Shiva could take a vow, not necessarily a Brahmin or an upper caste person. Now, Shiva was worshipped in the form of linga at the heart of most of these foundations which you see, or the temples you see at Sambur, Raipur. Which were obviously patronized by royalty, but they also catered to uninitiated ones with the wide range of ancillary deities that did not really have a place in the scriptures or the ritual manuals. So, for example, the principal ancillary deity would be Durga Mahishasur-mardini or Skanda or Saptamatrikas or nine grahas, or all of these kind of found a place around these Shaiva temples. Now so as I said, these Pashupatas really promised the magic to all these kings. And it's kind of, you see it in the inscription how they did it. So the early one of the 11th century inscription that talks about the event which took place in early 9th century, that how a priest Hiranyadama was commissioned by the king to perform a ritual which will guarantee the unity and independence of the kingdom from another kingdom. There is a similar inscription during Rajaraja Chola period, which is a little late 12th century inscription, but it tells us that when an army from Sri Lanka had invaded the mainland, and when it removed the door of, Rameshwaram temple, it obstructed the worship, carried away temple treasures, how Shaiva priest was engaged to perform a ritual for destruction of the enemy, and the ceremony continued for almost a month. Yeah, now the origins of Pashupata sect are very hazy. The direct reference to Pashupatas by the name Pashupatas began to appear only in the late 4th century CE, both in the text as well as in inscription. So you have, in Mahabharata refers to a group of Brahmins who worship Maheshwaras and observe a bull's vow or Govrata. And this would have been the earliest reference to a group of people who then become or later designated as Pashupatas. One of the early texts of Pashupata sect is Kaundinya's commentary on the Pashupata Sutra. It's 4th century source, which provides the philosophy of the religion, the religious movement, as well as the description of the god of Pashupatas. So the god have assumed the form of a Brahmin and has descended in Kayavatarana or Karohana in present-day Gujarat, and he has reached Ujjain by foot. In Ujjain, the Lord establishes himself in the cremation ground on the banks of Kripra river, and there he initiates the first disciple, Kushika, who is accepted to be a historical person. Now, on the right-hand side, the Mathura pillar inscription of 380 CE mentions one Uditacharya as the 10th descendant in the line of Bhagavata Kushika, making it seem, and then you calculate, like, if he's 10th in this generation, then how old the Pashupata, sect is, and sometime around 2nd century date has been, ascribed to the founder, Lakulish. Now, the Mathura pillar inscription doesn't specifically mention Pashupatas, but again, it speaks of Maheshwaras, precursors of Pashupatas. Then you start having the name Pashupata in the early 5th century onwards. There are quite a few inscriptions, Valakha copper plate or 9th century Bhoja inscription, Eklingji, various inscriptions in India talk about Pashupatas. One of the important one is Chintara Prashasti from Prabhas Patan in Somnath. It states that Shiva was incarnated in the form of Lakulisha and dwell in Karohana, as I said, in Lata in Gujarat, and 4 of his pupils, which is Kushika, Gargya, Kaurusha, and Mitra, who then become kind of originators of 4 branches of Pashupata Saivism. There are quite a few other texts, like I have mentioned. Very little Pashupata literature has survived, and some of the texts like Ganakarika, which contains only 8 verses by the 8th century scholar Hardatta. The text comes with the commentary of 10th century scholar Bhasarvadnya. Again, if you notice, the name starts with Bha. Called Ratnatika. Then there are a couple of Haribhadra Suri, Shadadarshana, Samuchaya, then quite a few. But then you have kind of descriptions of certain Pashupata practices in Buddha Charita, or Natya Shastra has several references to Pashupata. By the time you come to Skanda Puran, which is like 6th, 7th century, which was composed in the Pashupata landscape of Varanasi, mentions Lagundi and his 4 pupils. It was, as I said, it was composed in a heartland of Pashupatas. And then you start seeing the image of Lakulisha, who holds a club. But if you look at this image very, very carefully, the appearance of the club is like a representation of Linga. The name Lakulisha itself comes from the club he holds, so known in Sanskrit as Laguda, Lakuta, which is possibly derived from the word Linga, and with some abbreviations as Lakulin, Lakuta, Linga, Langula, Phallus, he becomes Lakulisha, which is kind of a founder of the Pashupatas. The presence of the club identifies the image of Lakulisha, and sometimes he is kind of in a teaching posture with his hands. Sometimes the early images he carries a water pot. But after 5th century, you see the immense spread of Lakulisha across India. He's always ichthyophallic with erect penis. He always holds a club. Sometimes he's seated, sometimes he's standing. Sometimes he is also with his 4 disciples. Here you see his 4 disciples. Sometimes the early Mathura image, he only has 2 disciples. The early Lakulisha images are inside the sanctum on the lintel. But the little later images, the Lakulisha moves outwards on the outer surface of the walls in a niche, or sometimes the external wall, but still on the main sanctuary. And literally, you have these Pashupata Lakulisha images in northern India, central India, Karnataka, Pattadakal, Badami, Aihole were like major Pashupata centers. Now, given the records, given the inscriptions in Cambodia that we were looking at, and the kind of Pashupata practices, the Saiva shrines you see, we would assume that, there would be so many Lakulisha images in Cambodia. Not really. In the recent work, one of my friends and colleagues, Shivani Kapoor, has drawn attention to this badly eroded image of one such ascetic, which is outside the temple wall, which is this image that I have enlarged. This image is very prominently placed in a niche on the exterior wall, as if he's getting his own space. If you look at the other ascetic images in Cambodia, which are really, it's above the lintel will have a top row of ascetics, or sometimes you have it in the floral decoration. You see so many ascetics that you sometimes miss it as a vegetation or something. You see ascetic figures here or here if you look at it carefully. So you really have to. It looks like a part of decoration. But with this image, it has its own niche, and it's ruined, but possibly carried a club that you see on the other Indian images. It also has a band, a yoga pat. It's called across his raised knees because he was an ascetic. So, you hold on to this posture for hours and hours. And to hold that posture, you need a band to, keep your knees and ankles together. The hands are broken, but possibly the gesture would have been the Dharmachakra mudra of the other ascetics. The earlobes are elongated. You have a kind of top knot. She is convincingly argues that this image would have been the possible Lakulisha image at Sambor Praiko, given the nature of the inscriptions and other shrines. And I agree with her because you see one of the images in Orissa, which is almost identical to the Sambor Praikuk image. Now, the Pasupata Sutra tells us about the 5 stages of Pasupata ascetic. What are the 5 stages in the life of Pasupata ascetic? In the first stage, he resides in the temple in the holy place of Maheshwara. He also bathes in ashes. He sleeps on the bed of ashes. He wears a garland which is taken from the image of Shiva. He worships Shiva in various ways, like he adopts a behavior of bull. He makes sound like a bull sound he'll make. He'll focus on just one syllable of Om. He wears nirmalya taken from the deity. He'll laugh out loud, like ha 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 laughter. He'll dance, he'll perform songs and dance. And with all these things, he worships Shiva, meditates on a sacred syllable of Om. And this is stage 1 of the ascetic practice. In the second stage, he moves out of the temple. He abandons all signs of his sectarian identity and behaves in a very provocative way, like he insults passers-by, he appears dirty, he behaves like a madman, he snores or limps or makes very obscene gestures towards women, so that he will, he'll draw disregard from those who see him. Now, the sutra interestingly traces on the transfer of sin and merit. So through all these insults that people call him, Pashupata receives the good merit of all those people, and in return, he transfers his bad karma to them. Now, Sutra says that, what he calls, draws from people, his bad karma is destroyed, and in the process, he gets purified. In the third stage, he withdraws from the public, and then he moves towards the abandoned place or a cave. He worships Maheshwara with the mental recitation and mantras. In the fourth stage, he moves to the cremation ground, and he lives on whatever he finds, reciting mantras constantly. He's constantly absorbed in the Rudra, his grace. And by doing this, he achieves the end of suffering. Dukkhanta is what the sutra talks about. And then he acquires supernatural powers of the deity. And then at the end, he becomes one in the company of Rudra. What happened is that Pashupata really maintained their individuality by the dress. They used to dress in certain way, by their philosophy, and also by the mode of the worship. Now, in the stage 1, as I said, the importance of ash is clearly stated in the sutra. So the stage 1 practices, you constantly, in fact, the Pashupata Vrata begins with the ritual of ash bath. And then constantly it talks about how you should cleanse yourself with the ash. So you bathe with ashes, you do something, you bathe again in ashes. and so on. The text describes how Rudra himself, having incarnated as Lakulisha in the body of dead Brahmin, I told you the story, at Karohana in the present-day Gujarat, began living on the altar of ashes in a pure spot defined as Ayatana. The sutra also mentions that the initiate is not allowed to make his own ashes, but somebody lights a fire for him and makes ashes. Now, when you look at the Khmer epigraphy, again, all these inscriptions are around, I mean, some are Sambor Praikuk, some are a little later, but around 8th, 7th, 8th, 9th century. All the inscriptions refer to Shiva and Shiva ascetics as bathed in or shining with white ashes. Even those which do not mention Pasupata specifically, but do refer to ash-covered nature of Shiva. They also describe a precious object of ash, how the precious object or how precious the ash was, because it was given in the gold pot. Sutra extensively, Pasupata Sutra, our only source of knowing the practices, describes extensively the ritual of Bhasma Snanam or ash bath. Some inscriptions even differentiate between a normal ash and a pungent ash, possibly describing their different uses in the ritual. So, for example, the inscription talks about, so much adhika of ash for such and such things, and then one adhika of pungent ash to clean the buns. Maybe it acted as a shampoo, we don't know, but the inscription do talk about, certain amount of ash and how much ash to be given to ascetics, to acharyas, to brahmins, and so on. Now, one adhika of ash is converted into approximately 5 kg of ash in the Khmer domain. Now, I haven't really come across these kind of inscriptions mentioning specific quantities of ash as well as the kind of ash, at least in India, but I don't really work on India, so I don't know. But if anybody knows, I would be more than happy to know whether and how the Indian inscriptions mention ash. Now, the ash inscriptional records match very well with Zhuangzang's record of Western regions when the Chinese monk traveled all over India in the 7th century. As you see, he constantly talks about how the ascetics are, smearing themselves with ashes, or the Deva temples, and how ascetics go naked and they don't really dress up, but they just, smear ashes. Ash bathing was performed several times a day. You eat something, you wash yourself with ashes. Every activity was followed by ash bathing. And the only mark that ascetic could carry was his religious affiliations, or a linga, or flowers taken from the god, or just a single cloth. Now, there are plenty of images, ascetic images on Cambodian temples, and you see these ascetics in just a single garment. Sometimes you also see them with piled up hair or jata. Sometimes you see a flower garland around the neck, but it's impossible to see the ash smear body in a relief sculpture. You can't identify a ascetic who is, smeared with ashes. Now, ash from good quality wood in large quantities were needed for several rituals in Pasupata practices, including the most crucial one of Diksha, or initiation, when the teacher transforms his disciple using ashes, which are empowered with mantras. The question is, in a tropical country, where would such a ritual take place? Because it's a first stage ritual when the ascetic lives in the temple. Where would the ash made? I mean, you have to make ash, and it's tropical country. It rains, almost every day in the evening. So the inscriptions mention number of ascetics, their teachers, it specifies the quantity. So there are some, there has to be a structure where the ash related rituals would have been performed. There is such structure called fire shrine, which would be the perfect solution to this problem. And this structure you see at Sambor Praikuk. Here you see a temple, and this building, which is right in front of the temple, placed usually in the southeast corner of the temple, would have been the perfect candidate for this. In the later temples, you always see this structure facing the central sanctuary, which are called as fire shrines, or popularly, these buildings are understood as library buildings. This is our current research, and it's been published in the Creative South, which I showed you initially, the publication edited by Andrea and Peter. Now, this was a collaboration between Shivani Kapoor, Andrea Cree, Olivia Cunan, and myself. And it's a team of iconographer, epigrapher, archaeologist, and architect, all working together to focus on a very unique feature of a Cambodian temple complex. You see this sculpture in every temple over the 500 years. Now, this sanctuary is called either library. This little red color highlighted thing is either called library or Homa structures by scholars without really knowing its function. And our paper argues that these structures with really thick wall and ventilation system were built as Guru Ayatana, where the practices such as Bhasma related rituals or ash related rituals, or imparting knowledge, Vidyadana, or initiation or a diksha of a Pasupata disciple would have taken place. I'll show you how these structures look. So this is the structure. It's the only structure in Khmer temple which has a ventilation system. And also it has a row of ascetics at the bottom and top. Unlike the other ascetic images I was showing, it's not like a decoration. It's a very marked sort of iconography on these structures. Inside the this sanctuary, you have a very chimney-like inside. And also the walls are almost 3 to 4 feet thick of this sanctuary. And you see the ventilation system on the sides. There is no pedestal for any image found from any of these of these buildings. As I said, on the exterior, the figures of ascetics are sculpted on the brickwork. So there is a strong possibility that the association of ascetic figures with, with these kind of structure. And as I said, these buildings continue over the period for next 4 centuries. I still have 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, go ahead. No problem.
Okay. So sometimes you also find a piece which is clearly like a modern ventilator, which would have been placed somewhere on these kind of ventilation systems. Sometimes it's just the row of columns and not like a diamond pattern holes. As I said, it starts with Sambor Praikuk, but over the periods, you see these annex building or, the place where ash-related Pasupata rituals would have taken place. 9th century, 10th century, the design changes slightly over the period, but the ventilation system is constant. At Bantishre, you find them at Angkor Wat, Bayon, at all the temples actually. Now, along with these buildings that you see as possible space of a Guru Ayatana in Pasupata sect, you also see some of the traces of Pasupata practices. One of this is the space that I talked about. Then you also see ascetics with Om cap, as we call it now. And there are certain findings, this might be the representation of Om. He's carrying this is a chignon of a ascetic, the headgear. You also see a linga, which he carries on the top here. It's a linga. Then you also see a guru and a disciple. He holds a book in his hand, possibly Pasupata Sutra. He's seated on a little pedestal, so he's a guru and he's imparting the knowledge to the disciple. Another head of an ascetic who carries a linga in front of the linga. You have a flower or a nirmalya taken from the deity. So you see some traces of the Pashupata practices in the sculptural art or relief art of Khmer temples. In India, in the present India, you also see these kind of things. This is from Jogeshwari. It's not a building, but where you find the, it is also found in a southeast corner where they make ashes. We call it dhuni, or but there is a constant fire which is lit in that area, and the production of ash is happening. You also see ash making in Haridwar, Rishikesh. You come across these ash smeared ascetics. In Amritsar or Jalandhar, a sect of Jangam, which actually literally means moving linga. Jangam means moving linga. They carry a linga on their head and move from temple to temple. Then you also have Lingayats in Karnataka who carry linga. So you do have certain traces or remnants, as I call it, of the Pashupata practices, even in the present day India. Now, the early temples of Cambodia, these are the early temples. And I said there is only one sandstone structure. This is the one at Sambor Praikuk. Rest of them are all brick temples. But if you look at the early Indian temples also, they follow a similar language. And if I don't caption them, it's very difficult to see which are Indian, which one is Indian and which one is Cambodian. What happens at Sambor Praikuk, a very, very unique sort of a temple form is developed, which is an octagonal tower. As far as my knowledge, this is the only place where you find octagonal temples in South Asia. I haven't really come across. There is one Mundeshwari temple in India, which scholars argue for an octagonal temple. It is, but it's from, I think, 16th or 17th century. These are all 7th, 8th century early octagonal temples. There are so far 10 octagonal temples are found at Sambor Praikuk. And maybe as the excavations go on, many more might come to our notice. Now, what are the possible origins of octagonal temples? And it's so tempting to, connect them or associate with the Pashupata landscape of Ishanapura. The concept of Ashtamurti, Shivashtamurti, is also found in the devotional hymns of Tamil Saiva saints. Actually, it can be traced back to the Vedic literature, and which assumes sort of a definite shape in Puranas. Indian iconographic texts describe that it should be presented in sculpture or set up in a Shiva temple. That's what the iconographic Indian texts talk about. I really have tried to look at the Indian examples, and I'll show you in a while. But for Pashupatas, Shiva Ashtamurti doctrine is kind of translated. It kinds of get really crystallized for them, because there are several rituals, especially the Ashtapushpika ritual, which involves worshipping Shiva by offering 8 handfuls and, the different forms of Shiva, Sarva, Bhava, Rudra, Ugra, Bhima, Pashupati, Ishana, and Mahadeva. So all kind of, are worshipped through this Ashtapushpika ritual. Harsha Charita, which was composed by Bana, again, it was kind of composed in the Pashupata landscape of Varanasi and the area near it, talks about Ashtapushpika method. There are quite a few inscriptions in India talking about Ashtamurti Shiva or Shiva worship. Shiva Ashtamurti actually becomes a verbal icon in many of Kalidasa's plays, Kumarasambhav, Shakuntala, Meghaduta, and so on. Several references to Shiva Ashtamurti are seen in Khmer epigraphy. As I said, but I haven't really found much on Indian side. These are the linga with 8 mukhas, or Ashtamukhi Shivalinga is what I have found. This is another one from Parel, kept at the museum in Bombay. But the one in Mandsaur in central India at least has some connection with Ashtamurti, because there is an inscription found from Junwani, which is close by, talks about the worship of Shiva Ashtamurti. So possibly the whole concept of Shiva Ashtamurti, which is there in India, was exhibited through maybe these Ashtamukhi lingas. And the same concept was displayed by Khmers through octagonal towers. As you come to 9th, 10th century, the temple of Bakong or East Mebon, you have many inscriptions talking about the installation of Shiva Ashtamurti, not at Bakong, but East Mebon has an inscription that talks about the installation of Shiva Ashtamurti, which would have surely been in these 8 shrines. So the octagon then splits into sort of 8 towers surrounded the central sanctuary. And they all would have housed the 8 different lingas, displaying the 8 aspects of Shiva or the epithets of Shiva. By the 13th, Khmer temples are always viewed through the prism of Indian temple architecture, but their adaptation of Indic texts and ritual resulted in a very unique vocabulary of art and architecture, which requires an independent perspective. Peter Bishop and Alexis Sanderson sum it up really well. It's really important to understand the evidence from Cambodia for our knowledge of Pasupata religion. Of course, by 13th century, Saiva practices gradually faded. In Cambodia, Theravada Buddhism, took over. But there is a Chinese traveler, not really traveler, an envoy of Temur Khan of Yuan dynasty called Zhou Daguan, who spent a year in Angkor in 1296, so late 13th century. And his travel record mentions that there are Banje or Pandits, Zugu or Buddhist monks. And then he says there are also Basivai, or possibly Pashupatas, wearing tall headdress, he talks, or jata. The tall headdress would be jata. And then he says they always make offerings to stones, which would possibly lingas. A beautiful photograph taken by my friend and colleague Shivani Kapoor, which really sums it up well. She took this photograph of a girl holding the same ascetic posture in front of the that little building that I was talking about, where ash-related rituals would have taken place. And Michael Meister really, sums it up. When texts don't tell us everything, monuments speak a language we must learn to decode. Thank you. I hope I didn't overshoot my time.
No, we have
Okay.
We have time.
Thank you.
If you
yeah, that's the biblio actually, if anybody is
I think if you could just hold it for about and somebody can always take a screenshot, or they can come back and get the complete they can use the video at a later point.
Sure.
Get this one. You have further page or just yeah. Great. So we have time, 15 minutes to discuss a few issues. So so this is really interesting. My understanding is largely that of India. I have been looking at the Khmer through photos. The first major question I have is the written documentations of the 6th to 10th century period that talks about the temple construction, the equivalent of the Saiva Siddhanta Agamas. Even the Pasupata Saivism of India, we have Pasupata Sutras and various other stuff. Temple construction is something that we largely get only from the Saiva Agamas, which clearly detail the icons, iconography. Subsequently, of course, you have the Shilpa texts and things like Mayamata, Vishnu Dharmottara, and various other further details. Right.
Vishnu Dharmottara is mentioned in one of the Khmer inscriptions. So possibly they had a knowledge.
Oh, that's really interesting. But my primary question of the Khmer temples, though I have too many questions running through, I have to control myself. The kind of temple construction that you said, they're almost equal to the, or similar to some of the Indian temples. You see that there is also a distinct difference. Therefore, I want to know what were the texts that were followed from the temple construction point of view, temple architecture itself, then the iconography, the primacy of various icons, the rituals, and so on. The whole lot.
Very difficult. Actually, nothing has survived given the very tropical climate. Second, the Khmer Rouge. Many temples were broken, the landmines are there. I mean, even now, not all the temples are completely demined. So it's very difficult to access some of the temples. The Khmer Rouge did a lot of destruction to, Khmer heritage. So nothing has really survived. Whatever inscriptions we have, we do know that certain texts were known to them. Like, as I said, Vishnu Dharma is mentioned. Also, they were aware of Kalidasa's plays, or you get these kind of idea that Puranas were known, Linga Purana, Vayu Purana. Of course, they knew, they had knowledge of texts. I don't know what they followed, but also it's the application of that knowledge. And, nowhere in India I have seen a literal Mount Meru, surrounded by moats and moats and moats. So you really see a literal interpretation.
You are right. You are right. So that was, it's not just the Shiva temples, but Angkor Wat is basically looking at building itself as a Meru. However, the Indian kings had, take for example, the Brihadishwaram of Tanjore, clearly saying that I am building Dakshina Meru. Right? Yeah. So it might not have been constructed in that mound and rins, etc. Yeah. But the mention is very clear. Right?
Absolutely.
But I know I'm very curious about the iconography, the variation, the distinction that we see from the largely the South Indian and North Indian icons themselves have some variation. But the Khmer ones are what appears to be sort of similar, but there is a distinct difference.
They all are Khmer. I mean, iconography is followed as per like the Vishnu will hold a conch or a disc.
Correct.
The iconography is same. I mean, they did get iconography, right? Whatever. It's from the day one you see the iconography as mentioned in what the text we have, iconographic text. But the images are very, very Khmer, or it's not like. And many a times people ask me, so the Indians came and built temples there. No, I mean, if Indians go to Cambodia and if a Khmer king asks them to build a temple, they would build what kind of temple they would? They would build an Indian temple. You don't have Indian temples.
Right. No, this is completely nativized. There is no doubt about it.
Absolutely. And also, it's not like India was building high-rise structures where they were. It all happens really simultaneously. It's like really parallel development. So,
in a sense, you can even say that, which is something that you pointed out, and there were some angry comments which I'm going to read out.
Yeah.
It as angry that some of the temples that the Khmer region has, even the remnants today, they were of a much bigger, much larger plan and boldness in them compared to the Indian ones of that same period. It's only in the 10th century and afterwards that right from whether it was Boja attempting, whether it was Rajaraja Chola attempting, whether the Udayeshwara temple, the ones in Kalinga trying to sort of outdo each other in terms of size was happening at a probably couple of centuries down the line, whereas the focus was on small temples, and to that there were a few comments like Manisha saying a lot of Indian art was destroyed by invaders. Prambanan is 200 years older than surviving art. She's basically underlining that surviving in bold.
Fair enough.
So can we say conclusively there weren't older structures and art that may have been destroyed? That's about India. I mean, you can answer that, but I will
Same
also...
would have happened in Southeast Asia also.
Right, exactly, right. And the other thing, somebody called Studio PP, following up, saying, follow up to question from Manisha, is there any evidence of architectural influence between Prambanan and any surviving architecture in India, or non-extant as mentioned in text? So, please go ahead and take this up and let's see.
No, but I'll tell you what excites me, that, the ideologies or political philosophies or religious philosophies, what was circulating in, through the sea, and everybody, how they interpreted, how, the same religion, but it's a different understanding or adaptation of that religion. But why it's important to study all these to build a larger knowledge of a tradition. I said. That's why I showed even the remnants in today's India, what you encounter, like Lingayats, Jangams, or, there has to be some connect to these earlier traditions.
Right. Okay.
So I don't really look at what influence, right from the beginning, I said, it's like traveled from center to periphery. There were many centers. Why can't we accept that there are many centers?
Right. No, naturally. I mean, we don't have to say that, there is only one center and everything
is periphery.
Only periphery, right? So that brings us to the question that Sripriya Srinivasan asks, other than the Pasupata cult, which other Saiva cults have influenced the early Khmer Empire? Was there any influence of the Ari cult in the 6th, 7th century in Cambodia? Ari, A-R-I. I don't know whether she means Hari or Vishnu, which is there as well anyway.
Of course, and also Khmer, it was always a syncretic religion. You have the state Shaivism lasted for almost 500 years. Till Angkor Wat was built, where the king tried to bring Vaishnavism back.
Yes, to Vaishnavism.
But that doesn't mean Shaiva temples weren't built or Buddhist temples weren't built. There were always kind of temple building continued, Buddhist, Vaishnavites, Shaivites. After Angkor Wat, around 12th, 13th century, then Jayavarman VII brought then the Buddhism becomes a state religion, which is a Mahayana Buddhism. So you don't really have early Theravada images. And then, of course, 13th, then you have desecrations. You have a desecration of many Mahayana images, converting them into Shaiva images. Then you again have a desecration, converting images to Theravada images. So, so on and so forth. But today, Cambodia is a Theravada Buddhist country.
Okay. There's a question from Ishan Harit. Could you please recommend a bibliography to study the changes that occurred in the Khmer region in the Angkorian period? Does your bibliography that you added, does that cover that?
No, but a good readable book is David Chandler's History of Cambodia, which covers these different periods in Cambodia. Pre-Angkor is understood as, before 9th century.
Okay.
But it's a very well-written book on history of Cambodia, very easy read. It's not it's not rigorously academic. It's very well researched. David Chandler is a good historian, but...
Okay. For the previous question, Sripriya Srinivasan says, Ari cult is early Mahayana Buddhism mixed with Tantric and Shaivism.
Correct. You find some evidence in Myanmar of Ari ascetics.
Okay.
You do have them in Myanmar. I haven't come across them in Cambodia, though.
Okay. Prabanja is asking a question. What is the language of the inscriptions?
The language is Sanskrit.
Sanskrit
Your inscriptions written in Brahmi, Pallava Granth, there are different scripts. The language is Sanskrit, but you also have Khmer language inscriptions.
At what point in time it moves from?
No, it doesn't move. I'll tell you. The Sanskrit inscriptions are mostly inscriptions which talk about the king and, the royal administration, sort of.
Okay.
The Khmer inscriptions talk about the people, who work at the temple, or, the different guilds of artists, or that sort of a difference. Largely, I mean, very simplistically put up, but you find both inscriptions, Sanskrit and Khmer.
Okay. Again, similarly related question is from Shivram Bharadwaj. When Saiva practices became popular, which language were they in? As in, I guess the day-to-day ritualistic language, mantras or worship, I'm assuming that.
Because today or at that time?
At that time.
Sanskrit.
Okay.
Even when the kings were Buddhist, like Jayavarman VII was a Buddhist king, he had his priest was Shaivite. So the Shaiva priest did, performed rituals even for Buddhist kings.
Okay. So here's a follow-up question, which is, are there extant literature like the Tamil Thevarams and the Bhakti poetry in Cambodia in I'm assuming in the Khmer language? Or indigenously created Sanskrit content?
That's the problem. Nothing has survived, as I said. Absolutely nothing has survived. But if, so you have to look at the practices, you have to follow the temple reliefs, inscriptions, and the textual material, which has survived in India, preserved in Nepal libraries, kind of things that everybody follows. But yeah, those are your only sources. Just to add one thing, you even today in Thailand, the Thai kings are consecrated by Bakums, which are Brahmins. So it's, you need to consider all these practices which have survived to understand what would have happened.
Okay. So again, I don't know how much time. We can take 2 or 3 questions quickly.
Okay.
Question, I can see the various angles from which the questions are coming, and we may need a lot of time to discuss them. One of the question is the Karikalamaya from Prabhanjas, which is the Karikalamaya relief at Bantai Shrey. Does it point to Tamil Saivism? Right? So we have to now talk about what is Tamil Saivism.
Yeah, I was just going to ask.
Which is a big issue by itself, but then, your immediate comment on this.
My immediate comment, even I'm interested in knowing more about Karaikal, because she's probably the only figure which has been depicted on several temples, not just Bante Shrey, even the Buddhist temple of Bayon has Karaikal. So even I would love to know why her and not others.
Right. And he's correct in that this is a pure Tamil construct. The 63 Nayanmars are largely, it's a Tamil Nadu Saiva Siddhanta idea.
Yes.
Basically of a larger Saiva Siddhantic content that was prevalent everywhere, but the saints were basically Tamil saints, was prevalent in the Tamil region, which obviously included the modern Kerala and parts of Karnataka and Andhra. They're depicted in these places as well. And how did that go? Why only her? You have a very, very relevant question that we have to ask. But we do know one thing. The idea of Shiva, the Nataraja, has her depicted very, very clearly in across the Chola period stone Natarajas in many, many, many places. So somewhere whether that idea probably went there, which took this idea. It's a question to be probed. Okay, so we'll park that because I think it's a much.
No, it's like, I mean, the scholarship is still. The scholars literally talk about Ati Marga, which would have been focused on severe ascetic practices, and Mantra Marga Shaivism, and there aren't like strict, this side is this, and the boundaries are so fluid.
Right.
And also Khmers would have absorbed certain practices into their own understanding of Shaivism.
Yeah. So I'll ask the last 2 questions. I will combine them together. I know there were many more questions, but I don't have the time. One from Venkat Srini says, are Pasupata rituals recorded in writing in India as well as Cambodia? In India, certainly yes, but in Cambodia we have, so you can add that. And Anna Varghese wants to know, what are the evidences we get about temple functionaries from the Khmer inscriptions? can you throw some light on the main groups mentioned? So I'll leave that as a last question. Yeah.
Okay. Now, the Pasupata texts that talk about in India, that's the source, as I said, about several practices. In Cambodia, several inscriptions mention certain Pasupata practices. But as I said, the ash-related ones are really, but there are many more through which we understand what were the practices.
Right.
And that's question, yes, the functionary and, actually there is the major the earlier scholarship did talk about, the North India influencing Cambodia or Southern India influencing Cambodia. But I would say the whole Pashupata development at Ishanapura or the Sambor tribe took 7th-8th century, the parallel development is probably Patadakal, Badami, Aihole. Those are really strong Pashupata sites in Karnataka.
Right.
So you do have inscriptions mentioning about, I would say, not just the priest, but, certain varnas. There was no caste system in Cambodia, but you do have different varnas mentioned, like a beetle leaf varna, or a varna of dance hall, or a varna of golden cup. So these are different varnas which are mentioned. Also, they talk about how these people are attached to the temple, what are their temple duties, or, what sort of food or water or other things we get to know about, kind of food that was getting prepared, or, how many wells are attached to the temple, who are the people who are kind of making it sure that the well is secured. So we do know from these understanding, but these inscriptions, most of these kind of inscriptions are in Khmer.
Okay.
These are not Sanskrit inscriptions.
Okay. Thank you. I know there's a lot.
I don't know whether I have answered it because it's.
No, there's so much more to discuss in this. Maybe we will have we'll schedule some other lectures to take up some specific aspects of it. But now we have to move on to the next lecture.
No, please. Very much. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
I'd like to invite Kishore to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Swati. And I think, like a lot of other things, is also, it also threw light into our ignorance and what we do not know.
We all are learning. Okay.
So thank you so much for such a.
I'll just leave and then.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
So following that, we are ready to now go to our next lecture. I'd like to introduce a speaker, the second speaker for today. Dr. Anirudh Deshpande is a professor of modern history, Department of History, Delhi University. He has been a Teen Murthy Fellow, ICCR guest professor at the Vienna University, Austria, visiting professor at NBU Siliguri and at the History Department, AMU. He has authored several books, some of them being The British Raj and its Indian Armed Forces, British Military Policy in India, 1900 to 1945, Colonial Constraints and Declining Power, Hope and Despair, Mutiny, Rebellion and Death in India, 1946, The Rise and Fall of a Brown Water Navy, and many other books. Since 1992, he has published regularly in the EPW, IES HR, Studies in History, Social Scientist, and the Inclusive Online, and the Gordon Martel Encyclopedia of War, and David Ludden Oxford Online Research Encyclopedia. In 2015, he wrote the introduction to Govind Pansare's Who Was Shivaji? He has also published short stories in English and Hindi. Most of his fiction can be read on the multilingual online journal, Matru Bharati. His latest publications also include a research paper on the polyphony of the sources for the Third Battle of Panipat in the Social Scientist. A paper comparing Collingwood and Marx is forthcoming also in the Social Scientist. Dr. Anirudh Deshpande, in his talk titled Forgotten Naval Histories of Early Modern India, will explore the nature, scope and influence of Indian naval prowess in the early modern period and explain its local context in the Indian Ocean world. We now welcome Dr. Anirudh Deshpande to deliver his lecture.
Thank you very much, Kishore, for introducing me. And nice to see Badri Seshadri, who is supposed to be with us throughout the talk. And I saw him conducting the previous talk with a professional elan, which I really admire. And I'm very happy and I'm extremely grateful for the organizers to giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts about Indian naval history with the people who have organized this and possibly a few participants. Badri, some people wanted me to tell them how to get onto this program because for them this link is not working. So
no, this link I have kept it only for the
participants and
speaker. It's available on YouTube. So that's
okay.
where they can. But if there are some people here, I can let them as long as they don't say anything and they just, don't interrupt the discussion in any way. I will. There is one person waiting in the waiting room. I will let that person in so that you can continue and please go ahead and
some people wanted to be part of the proceedings.
That's okay. But we will we will see how best we can manage that. Yeah, please do go ahead. Fine. We can have your pet as well as part of the whole discussion. Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm just my cat is sitting here on the table with me, and he might continue to interrupt my talk.
Okay, that is perfectly fine with
I think you have allowed.
I've let one person in, and as long as they all are quiet, that's fine.
That person is my wife, so she's going to.
Okay.
She'll keep quiet.
Okay.
So there were others who wanted to join, but I think this will be available on YouTube later.
No, it's available on YouTube. There are plenty of people already there following it.
All right. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk for about let's say about 40-45 minutes.
Yes, you can. 45 to 60 minutes. It's up to you. And we can then have a conversation.
Delhi University professors, especially at the department, are usually quite used to speaking for 3 hours. So I'll not do that here. It's always a risk to call somebody from my department, especially people like me who have big classes and long classes. So we have the tendency of just going on and on, But if you feel that I'm exceeding the time allotted to me, please,
I will intervene.
Kind enough and curt enough to cut me off and ask me and give me. You can't obviously give me a little chit from there, which normally we do here, but you can always butt in and say that, look, you've got 5 minutes or something like that. Okay.
Sure.
So nice to be with you, and I'm going to start my lecture now. For all it's worth, So this is a particular area of research which has started started inviting some interest from the scholars nowadays, but for a very long time, when it came to discussing the main issues in the naval history of India between 1650 and 1857, in which I have tried to locate in my book on the Brown-Water Navy and Kanadri Angre, the differences between local brown-water navies versus, global bigger blue-water navies. So these issues have been mentioned by historians earlier, but they've not really been explored to the extent that they are being explored now. And this lecture questions several assumptions of modern naval history, which by inception has been rather Eurocentric in its orientation. When you look at the modern writing about naval history in the Indian Ocean, you realize that this history writing in the Indian Ocean about the Indian Ocean region began during the British colonial period. But written Indian naval history since the 19th century has been colored by colonial prejudice, which was part and parcel of the broad a colonialist historiography developed in India by James Mill, whose work is well known, and his numerous intellectual successors who continue to remain active in India till 1947 and even thereafter. Some of them, it is said, metamorphosed into what I think is rather simplistically called the Cambridge School of Historiography. This Eurocentric history glorifies the European navies and denigrates the indigenous Indian naval traditions by lumping them under the nomenclature of piracy. And confronted by this formidable body of scholarship on the subject, the foremost task of the Indian historian is to recover these Indian quote-unquote brown water navies, as I have called them in my book on Kanhoji Angre and the Maratha Navy, from colonial and even post-colonial condescension. The process of decolonizing the history of the late medieval or early modern Indian powers can begin by outlining the main issues of naval history and sea power in the context of early modern Indian history. And the aim of this lecture is to highlight these issues for a fruitful discussion and other productive outcomes. Later, I'm sure people will ask questions and we can have an interesting discussion on some of the issues which I plan to raise in this lecture. Let me mention the main indigenous naval powers of India during the age of mercantilism and early European colonial expansion in the Indian Ocean region. And in fact, there were many small groups of, you can call many small groups were active in the Indian Ocean world. But specific to India, you have the Angres of the Konkan, who were Maratha admirals for a very long time, till their power was extinguished by the Peshwa. And the Maratha Navy came under the family of, the Peshwa appointed family of, based in Bassein, which became the most important naval suba of the Peshwa kingdom after the 1750s and 60s. Then you have the Siddhis of Janjira, which is a very interesting place to visit. It's an island fortress, and it was practically impregnable for a very long time. And finally, finally people began to go there, and it lost its strategic importance with the decline of the Siddhis as a military power after the mid-18th century on the western coast of India, which is basically the Konkan. And then you have the very famous but underreported family of the Marakkars, the Kunjali Marakkars of the Malabar, who made exemplary use of a brown water navy to register their political dominance in their respective regions from the 16th to the mid-18th century. So all these powers, the Angres of the Konkan, the Siddhis of Janjira, and the Kunjali Marakkars of Malabar had large groundwater navies, which they used to shore up their sovereignty on the coasts which they commanded. And the main question which we ask with respect to these people is, how did they manage to resist the technologically superior navies of the West for so long? And why did this resistance end? And these are the important questions of Indian history and notions of sovereignty in the early modern and late medieval period. This lecture lays down the guidelines for producing a rigorous naval history of India in the light of the new approaches to the subject available today. In fact, one of the first issues is hermeneutical, because at the heart of the matter is a redefinition of naval history as a concept made possible by researches into local naval contexts. So the first question is, what is naval history, and whether India had a naval history in the strict sense of the term. So we must realize that while global history remains important, local contexts both qualify and enrich its submission. And a lot of work which has been done on local histories of the various localities, regions, sub-regions in the Indian Ocean world in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, especially the work of people like Edward J. Alpers and M.N. Pearson and so on, have actually enriched our understanding of the histories which unfolded in these local contexts, but which have not received the kind of importance they should have in broad historiography, simply because they are, simply because they, they don't fit into the Eurocentric perspectives which have guided our view of these histories for a very long time. And to begin with, the British wrote accounts of English naval exploits as documented history, the best example of which is the tome on the East India Company Navy, the Bombay Marine, by a former officer of the history of the Indian Navy, a man called C.R. Lowe. He wrote a very big two-volume history of the Indian Navy written by, this was written in the late 19th century. And in fact, if you go through this book, you realize that, there's a very interesting introduction in which C.R. Lowe narrates the entire process which preceded the writing of this history of the Indian Navy, which had been forgotten by the people, which had been forgotten by, by historians of that time, naval historians, as well as historians of the East India Company, and all those people who were busy writing accounts of the British conquest of India in the late 19th century. So in this history of the Indian Navy, C.R. Lowe actually tried to recover a history which was already lost in the 19th century. But of course, this is a very Eurocentric, very pro-British kind of account. And this book uses the term Indian Navy for the hybrid navy of the Bombay Presidency. And this term was considered pretentious by the Royal Navy officers who called the Indian Navy a grab service after the Gurabs commissioned by it and their native crews of petty officers and sailors. The Portuguese also wrote in similar vein. European captains eager to please their home authorities painted Indian naval resistance in colonial colors. Indian indigenous navies thereby became pirate gangs in self-righteous colonial accounts. And Indian naval prowess does not feature in the list of great navies or naval histories in general. That much we know. And the naval powers of the early modern period were Spain, Portugal and England, Holland and France. The pre-colonial, in fact, when you look at pre-colonial China, you have a very interesting story. Pre-colonial China had a large ocean-going navy capable of staying at sea for months, and probably it is reported that Chinese junks had sailed up the western coast of Africa or had even circumnavigated the globe well before Magellan. And had China not turned inwards in seafaring policy from the 17th century, the history of the Pacific and Indian Ocean regions would have been different. So to a casual observer, written history registers an absence of Indian naval history. In the work of retired Admiral A.T. Mahan, or in the work of Mahan's work, Influence of Sea Power on History, is a very important seminal work of naval history across, which is applicable to world history in the early 20th century. And then you have, in the post-Second World War period, you have works by, historians like Geoffrey Parker, who has given us the concept of the military revolution, which has chapters on the naval rise of the modern West, in which local navies, indigenous navies don't feature at all. So to a casual observer, written history registers, in fact, most of written history in the West and often also in the East, registers an absence of Indian Navy and Indian naval history. And that leads us to ask a very important question, whether, whether you have, whether you have a naval history at all. And this question needs to be considered, needs a considered answer, because India's seafaring history goes back to the times of the Indus Valley civilization. The history of Indian sea trade is well documented and established, and we wonder whether this was possible without naval protection. After all, piracy is as old as sea trade. Trade, piracy, and land robbery have gone hand in hand in history, and there's enough material, enough evidence to, basically, tell us that, as I've said, piracy is as old as sea trade. Trade, piracy, land robbery, they go hand in hand. Further, 16th century India witnessed the rise and spread of gunpowder technology. And under Western and Ottoman influence, Indians began to manufacture and use firearms on a large scale in the 16th and 17th centuries. Common Era. Portuguese accounts are also replete with references to guns being mounted on Asian warships, including the fleet of warships maintained by the Samudri Raja in Kerala. Samudri Raja is referred to as the Zamorin in the Portuguese and European accounts. The imperial and naval history of the Cholas of Tamil Nadu is too well known to be repeated here. They had developed a blue water navy which comprised of oar and sail-driven ships, and which was capable of carrying troops over large distances, like the Roman Navy used to do in the ancient times. Seaborne trade and conquest had played an important role in sustaining Chola power in the 9th and 10th centuries AD. And when you come to the medieval period, the Mughal military hardware we find was very sophisticated, but they left their trading and Hajj ships to the protection of the brown water navy of the Siddhis of Janjira. In fact, numerous trading and Hajj ships were quite large and carried a lot of cargo and numerous passengers, but had no significant firepower, despite the Mughals being a gunpowder empire. Till the mid-18th century, the Siddhis were the naval arm of Malik Amba and the Mughals, whose trading and Hajj ships regularly sailed towards the Persian Gulf, Arabia, and East Africa. And a lot of work on this is available in many books, on medieval India, medieval Indian history, and in the early modern history. But not much work has been done on these Ethiopian seafarers till date. And the well-researched monograph on them by D.R. Banerjee, which was published many, many years ago in the 1930s, remains the best work so far. So, in fact, it is time that a scholar does another, another piece of research on the Siddhi Navy and the Siddhi power on the Konkan coast. So, I mean, although Banerjee's work is very extensive and very solid, but I think the time has come for a new work to emerge on the Siddhi Navy. The Siddhi Navy and its integration with the coastal and island forts was the model which the Marathas followed. The ability of the Siddhi captains to project power on the coast from their island stronghold of Janjira impressed the Marathas, and we find Kanoji Angre replicating their efforts in early 18th century. It is known that initial Maratha military prowess, including the popularization of the Bargi system of light cavalry, owes its rise to Malik Amba, who recruited Marathas in large numbers in the Nizam Shahi armies. There was another, I mean, apart from the Siddhis and the Marathas, there was another formidable naval power which operated from the southern part of western coast of India, namely Malabar, in the 16th century. The intrepid naval power created by a family of appointed admirals posed a serious challenge to growing Portuguese hegemony in the Indian waters after the arrival of Vasco da Gama at Calicut in 1498. The century-long history of the naval family of Kunjali Marakkars is practically unknown to most Indians and non-Indians, and especially in North India, the history of the Kunjali Marakkars is practically unknown. In the Malabar, in Kerala, and so on, people have heard of Kunjali Marakkar. In fact, films have been made on the Kunjali Marakkars, and these films have been done quite well. But outside Kerala, their name is not much known. The Kunjali Marakkars were admirals of the Zamorin, Samudri Raja of Calicut, which is called Kozhikode today, and kept the Portuguese at bay, inflicting several crushing defeats on their fleets during the 16th century. And mind you, this is a brown water navy defeating the Portuguese navy, and the Portuguese navy often had fairly large warships built on the European pattern. Although the Portuguese navies raised in Goa and in Calicut were also the kind of hybrid navies which were built by the English in Surat and in Bombay later. The Marakkar resistance forced the Portuguese to operate from Cochin in the south and Goa in the north. So, in fact, the Marakkars had made Calicut, and the areas around Calicut quite unsafe for the Portuguese. And in the 16th century, the Marakkars were literally the thorn in the side of the Portuguese coastal trade, the value of which was considerable. And because of Marakkar resistance, Portuguese losses were mounting. And over time, the Kunjali Marakkars grew too powerful for the Zamorin himself, who allied with his old enemy, the Portuguese, to bring the Marakkar family down in 1600. And this finally established Portuguese naval supremacy on the southern part of the western coast of India. In contemporary Portuguese and European accounts, the history of the Kunjali Marakkars appears as the discursive, exotic story of the Malabar pirates. A similar history was repeated in the case of the Angres of the Konkan in 1755-56. The story of the Angres and the Marakkars is similar, and both were defeated in the ultimate analysis by an Indo-European alliance. When we look at the maritime accounts of the mercantilist age, we realize not only the omnipresence of piracy, but also the fact that its description is always discursive, with the kettle calling the pot black. Thus, anyone who resisted naval power, European naval and mercantile intervention in the Arabian Sea, became a pirate in European accounts. And these accounts passed into history books written by European soldiers, diplomats, and scholars, and comprise the foundation of the Eurocentric bias central to modern education in European countries. Although much has changed in the 20th century, the general ignorance of local Asian histories continues to do its bit for the sustenance of Eurocentrism in the military and naval histories written in the West. The naval history of India goes back at least to the Tamil Cholas of the 10th and the 11th centuries. The Chola kings used naval power to conquer Sri Lanka and parts of the Malay Peninsula and Indonesia. And this was no mean feat for its time by any standards. In general, the practice of maintaining fleets of warships to protect and raid merchant ships seems to have persisted over time. Travelers noticed this. On the southern part of the western coast in Barkur, the Moroccan visitor Ibn Battuta encountered a Hindu ruler, quote unquote, with a fleet of 30 warships engaged in raids on merchant ships in the 14th century. So you have travelers' accounts on which we can rely. And these travelers often came by sea, and they were, they were exposed to piracy, and they were exposed to military raids and so on and so forth. And they have left behind rich accounts of what used to happen, on and around the coasts of India. And many of these travelers, in fact, many of these travelers used to come by the Arabian Sea. And in the 17th and 18th century, you have Arab powers with their fleets harassing the Portuguese as well as the other powers in the Arabian Sea. You have the Omanis who rose to prominence in the 16th century, challenging the Portuguese regularly and engaging in battles with them. So this is not this is not Arabian Sea, and the Indian Ocean is not a region which is subdued very easily by the Europeans, although the Europeans, especially the Portuguese, brought into this region the systematic use of force in trading activities for the first time, and they were extremely violent in their activities because they wanted to monopolize the trade of this region. But it is not as if they were not met by naval resistance mounted by a number of powers which were active in the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean region. India, the largest peninsula in the world, remained the pivot of the Indian Ocean world trade and commerce for several centuries. If you look at the map of India, you realize that the Indian peninsula actually bisects the Indian Ocean into almost two equal parts. It is the highway which connected the Pacific and the Atlantic worlds. It is a highway which connected the Indian Ocean and the Pacific worlds. And there were many overlapping, interlocking trade connections and trade networks which passed through the Indian Ocean. And India was a linchpin for all this. In fact, Malaysian traders, Indonesian traders, even Chinese traders and visitors and so on, they used to come regularly. You have rich accounts left behind by Malay traders who used to visit the Vijayanagar Empire, and this entire account has been narrated in the works of Barbara Andaya, who's a big scholar of the Indian Ocean region, like M.N. Pearson. So India bisects the Indian Ocean into two almost equal parts. The Arabian Sea connects to the Atlantic Ocean, and the Bay of Bengal connects to the Pacific Ocean. And this unique geographical location of India and its diverse pre-colonial manufactures and production of cotton, silks, and spices made it the most significant point of intersection of the Indian Ocean cultures, trade, and travel for the greater part of its history. So while the richness of the commercial history of this region is well established, and we have works of great maritime historians like Ashin Das Gupta and so on, who have done a great amount of work on this maritime, and Ranabir Chakrabarti and others who have done great work, big work, solid historical work on the commercial history of this region. Not much is known of its naval history. The naval part of this commercial history, the naval part of this trade history, is still not well researched. It's still a minor part of this larger historiography of the trade and culture of this region. And India till the 18th century was a large exporter of spices, cotton, silk, and other luxury goods, high in demand in Europe, as is well known. All economic historians acknowledge this. It was a larger importer of bullion and selected commodities from Europe, and this bullion made India the sink of precious metals till 1750. In fact, this accumulation of precious metals in India created the fame and glory of the Mughal Empire, which is much denigrated for the wrong reasons these days. And these two dominant economic trends of the period of capitalist mercantilism underscored the absence of the historical need for India to develop an ocean-going blue water navy. In contrast, the European powers needed strong blue water navies to secure their supplies of bullion and wage naval wars against competitors. The Anglo-Spanish, Anglo-Dutch, and Anglo-French commercial naval wars, which were intercontinental between 1550 and 1760, should be studied in this context. We must also remember the naval history of the Mediterranean, where the Italian city-states, Ottoman Turkey, and Egypt clashed at sea to control the rich Asian trade which passed through the region, making the Italian states rich and opulent. So, in fact, if you look at the naval history of the Mediterranean, then why, by way of the trade linkages between Egypt, Arabia, and the Italian states with India, and Indian commodities playing an important role in enriching the Italian city-states, this entire struggle to control the Arabian Sea trade, it starts playing a very, very important role from the 13th, 14th century onwards. And this is one of the reasons which prompts people like Henry the Navigator of Portugal and the Spanish monarchs later on to constantly search for a sea route to India. And it is for nothing that Christopher Columbus, when he quote unquote discovered America, continued to believe till the end of his life that he had actually gone to India, and he got confused in the Caribbean, and and he thought he had gone to India, and he got gold from there and so on, and he even imagined that he had seen Christians there and their pagodas and their churches and so on. But that's a different question. That's a different history altogether. So the Arabian Sea, Red Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea were significant constituents of the Indian Ocean World Trade Network, which connected Asia to Europe, carried on largely by Arabs and Jews. The Geniza records, especially the spectacular Cairo Geniza records, deal with the economic, cultural, and commercial history of the Jews in medieval and early modern centuries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And these have been used by historians to recover and reconstruct new histories of the mercantilist period. So, historians who have looked at the Geniza records, some of these Geniza records are mentioned in Ferdinand Brodel's book on both his books, one on the Mediterranean in the age of Philip, and the one on capitalism and civilization and so on. You find that the Annals School historians looked at these, and then later on, historians in the contemporary period in which we find ourselves living, they've also now gone through Geniza records, and these Geniza records are very rich records. They used to keep records of individual Jew traders, their letters, their wills, their property dealings, commodity records, and all kinds of things. So these are very rich records which actually narrate and highlight the importance of the Indian Ocean world and the Indian Ocean trade to the European economy, the early modern mercantilist European economy, and the process which we later on identify as the rise of the modern West. India has a politically intriguing and socially rich naval past, which is something which I have tried to narrate in my book on the Brown Water Navy, rise and fall of the Brown Water Navy, and Kanoji Angre. I mean, this can be displayed after the lecture very briefly for those who are present. And so obscured by commerce is this naval past of the Indian Ocean that a lay reader of its history may be tempted to ask whether India has a naval history. Interested historians have periodically visited the naval history of the Indian Ocean region, though its local history plays a minor role in the Eurocentric narratives which characterize world military and naval history. And we must not underestimate the scale and commercial value of early modern coastal trade into which the Europeans began to tap from the time of their arrival in India. The strategic importance of the brown water navies must be seen in the context of this lucrative coastal trading which went on, which is the quotidian trade which goes on, and which plays a very important role, which is as important to the transcontinental trade, which assumes and which becomes quantitatively very large from the 16th century onwards. Historians generally focus on the world historians and global historians and historians of capitalism and historians of the Indian Ocean world in general look at this bigger picture, but they don't pay attention to this very lucrative coastal trade. In fact, when you look at the Dutch model of colonialism emerging in Asia, which the British copied in India, you find that the Dutch actually played a very, they began to milk this local trade in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in the South Pacific, in and around Ceylon, and so on and so forth. And they realized that this local trade was also worth, it was worth a great deal of money. So, what I have done in my work, I have attempted a course correction from a perspective located outside the Eurocentric military revolution paradigm, which is asserted by Geoffrey Parker in his book of the same name in 1988. And while my work does not disprove the emergence of global Western military hegemony during the period 1500 to 1800, this is the period known as the period of merchant capitalism. It is the period known as sometimes in Marxist historiography, Marxist parlance, it is called the period of primary accumulation of capital, which leads to the Industrial Revolution, which starts in England in the late 18th century and it inaugurates the era of industrial capitalism from the early 19th century onwards. And when I started researching naval history of this country and of the Indian Ocean world, my aim was not to disprove the emergence of the global Western military hegemony, because there is so much evidence. And in fact, the fact that the West emerged as the primary imperial and colonial power of the modern period will make it very difficult for us to disprove the story. But my aim was to make the story more interesting and less disrespectful of the indigenous naval and military traditions of the Indian Ocean world in the same period. The defeated also have a history, and sometimes this history is very interesting. Although history is usually written from the perspective of the victors survive, the victors, they feel they have the right to write the history of the vanquished. But it is the job of the holistic historian, and it is also the job of the third world historian and the Indian historian, who is anti-colonial and anti-imperialist in orientation, to also unearth the richness of local histories, local tradition. And the rediscovery of this lost past has contemporary lessons. For instance, what, we may ask, was the nature of indigenous resistance to rising European naval power in the Indian Ocean world? Why and how did the Kunjali Marakkars on the Malabar and the family of Kanoji Angre on the Konkan coast successfully challenge European naval power for several decades in the 16th and the 18th centuries, respectively? And finally, what caused their eventual defeat, and what conclusions can we draw about the nature of the land-based polities which colluded with the Europeans against them. So a description of the character and activities of the Maratha Navy we find is given by Sir Jadunath Sarkar in Shivaji and His Times. And Sarkar wrote, in picturing Shivaji's navy, Sarkar wrote, we must banish from our minds the idea derived from Europe of a line of men of war boldly sailing into the boundless open sea and defeating an opposing fleet by superior maneuvering and gunfire. The Maratha fighting vessels were meant for work in the coastal waters only. Their tasks were to escort his merchant ships from port to port or sadly out of their shelter in some landlocked harbor, swoop down upon an enemy trading vessel or small fighting craft, and after dismasting, capture it by boarding and hand-to-hand fight. For serving this end, their cumbrous gunboats called gurabs had to be towed at sea by rowboats so as to overtake the enemy, shoot off his masts, and finally send a boarding party in the rowboats to capture the prize. In fact, Shivaji's sea battles merely followed the tactics of land fighting. Even in gunpowder, his largest vessels were inferior to third-rate English or Portuguese fighting ships. He mounted only a few and small guns, and the marksmanship of his gunners was poor and slow, unquote. This rather sobering view of Maratha naval prowess has been modified by developments in Indian historiography over time, but in general conforms to the popular military history perspective on the subject. Without using the term brown water navy, quote unquote, Sarkar defined its historical character for us early in the development of modern Maratha historiography. His conclusions were based on meticulous research, later borne out by the researches of the preeminent nationalist historian S.N. Sen, and they inveigh against the contemporary tendency to exaggerate the achievements of Indian, read Hindu in media parlance, military and naval forces in medieval or early modern Indian history. Indian positivist historians of the colonial era were dedicated to searching for the weaknesses in the pre-colonial Indian or Maratha quote-unquote nation in order to explain the rise of British power in India better in military terms. Further, to understand the naval activities of the early modern Indian indigenous coastal powers perhaps boils down to comprehending the historical peculiarities of the age of sail. Let me turn to the view of the politically influential expert Mehan on naval history and doctrine to get an idea of what a brown water and blue water navy meant in the age of sail. So we are talking, when we talk about the brown water navies in the 18th century, 17th, 16th centuries, we are talking about the age of sail, which was superseded by the age of steam finally only in the 19th century. Now, Mehan's work should always be taken seriously because it's a very influential work. It has influenced policy making in many countries. And after all, let's not forget his magnum opus influenced naval construction and doctrine in Germany from across the Atlantic in the early 20th century. And what did naval power mean, according to him, in the age of sail, or what was naval power just before the ironclad steamer replaced sail in modern history? The galley, he wrote, a galley is a kind of ship which is basically which uses a number of people who use the oars. Basically, in the galley, the sail is less important and the oar is more important. So it's from there that the term galley slaves comes. The galley, he wrote, has one striking resemblance to the steamer, but differs in other important features which are not so immediately apparent and are therefore less accounted of. In the sailing ship, on the contrary, The striking feature is the difference between it and the more modern vessel. The points of resemblance, though existing and easy to find, and not so obvious, and therefore are less heeded. This impression is enhanced by the sense of utter weakness in the sailing ship as compared with the steamer, owing to its dependence upon the wind, forgetting that, as the former fought with its equal, the tactical lessons are valid. The galley was never reduced to importance by a calm, and therefore receives more respect in our day than the sailing ship. Yet the latter displaced it and remained supreme until the utilization of steam. So, why did this sailing ship ultimately win against the galley in the long run? The answer is rather prescient. To quote Mehan again, the powers to injure an enemy from a great distance, to maneuver for an unlimited length of time without wearing out the men, to devote the greater part of the crew to the offensive weapons instead of to the oar, are common to the sailing vessel and the steamer as the power of the galley to move in a calm or against the wind. In some, quote unquote, if the blue water navy deploying firepower aboard the purpose-built man of war was unbeatable by the galley on the high seas, a brown water navy reliant chiefly on rowing in the calm had its own tactical strengths. Rowing in the well-known shallows was tactically possible for a limited amount of time. On the high seas, the galley would have proved useless in any case. Seen in this perspective, the achievements of the Angre Navy, which often comprised a large number of galleys, the galbats, which were usually smaller than the bigger masted gurabs, appear outstanding. We can easily imagine the enormous hard work done by the Lashkars at the oars in these ships in tropical weather. This explains why the Portuguese and the English employed the native Lashkars known for their energy and resilience in the tropics on their ships in large numbers. The issue was not only the increased expense incurred in recruiting Europeans ill-suited to the tropics, but also the efficiency of the Lashkars, an observation made by the survey veteran Clements Markham later in the 19th century. The third important aspect of Indian naval history is technology. The revision in historiography suggests that medieval India was not a dark age. The dark age hypothesis regarding quote unquote Muslim India is a colonialist figment. India is a subcontinent and generalizations about one of its regions may not fit other areas. And the traditional view of the stasis in military technology attained in medieval India is best expressed in the words of a respected historian known for his work in the area. So, according to Iqtidar Alam Khan, quote unquote, the nature of firearms and manner of their use remained largely unaltered from the death of Akbar, 1605, to the time of Nadir Shah's sack of Delhi, 1739. This particularly applied to heavy mortars. The light artillery was also not immune to the general trend of technological stagnation, a few noteworthy innovations in it notwithstanding. Several new techniques relating to firearms came from Europe during this period, but with a few exceptions, did not find ready acceptance in Mughal India. The inability of the Indians to copy European cast iron cannons and adopt more efficient flintlocks as standard military muskets were perhaps the two most conspicuous Indian failures in the field of firearms during the 17th century. This is a, unquote, this is a narrative of stagnation till the advent of European companies whose native armies were led by Europeans and trained in the European way of war. Following the success of the European trained native battalions in the 18th century, modernization was initiated by many Indian polities. And without this modernization, the British conquest of India would not have become a long drawn affair. Randolph Cooper, who is a historian of the Marathas, who is also a great admirer of the Mughal and Maratha militaries, presents a case against the quote-unquote cultural imperialism espoused by colonialist historiography. Evidently, there was much more to the military success of the Marathas, which must be recovered by a different reading of Maratha history. Technological weakness is marginal to the best history of the Marathas written after World War II. In sum, the topics of, I'm referring to, I'm referring to the history written by Stewart Gordon, the Marathas, which is the best history of the Marathas according to me, in which he really makes very light of the technological weakness argument. In fact, in some, the topics of naval manpower and technology remain interesting because all navies in the early modern period were hybrid. What are known as the English, Dutch, or Portuguese warships of the time were products of a multi-ethnic syncretic shipbuilding technology. The military technology, especially the use of cannons on sea, which underwrote European colonial conquest in the age of mercantilism, also resulted from the European states borrowing bombardier and foundry expertise from various distant regions. The Portuguese military supremacy was based on the great quality of their bombardiers recruited from the main European weapon manufacturing centers, such as Flanders, Germany, Italy, and France. So what can we say? I mean, when we look at this entirely, look at a very rich local naval history of the Arabian Sea from the 16th till the mid 18th century. I mean, the political details of this can be found in my book and other books written on these topics, So what can we say in conclusion? We can say the following. First, the Eurocentric perspective on Indian naval history must be challenged to place the brown water Indian navies in their proper historical context with a respect which their subalterns as well as captains deserve from sympathetic historians of the day. India misses a naval history with a capital N, but its coastal people have demonstrated their naval prowess in ample measure. This naval activity and its periodic demise because of opposition from Indian land powers and their alliances with the Europeans is a subject of research. This subject can become rewarding and rich outside the anachronistic framework of both imperialist and nationalist history. The limitations of the Europeans in the shallows of India and the technological innovation of the Indian powers like the Angres of the Konkan and Marakkars of the Malabar are interesting topics, interesting subjects. Their flexible use of ships, fortresses, their use of fortresses to project power over the sea, and their use of sea power to project power on the land are extremely interesting subjects for the military, political, and economic historians. In the last 30 years, much revision in Indian military and political history has occurred, and scholars should pay attention to this revolution in Indian historiography while researching themes related to Indian brown water navies. So when we move away from Eurocentrism, we find, we find extremely interesting things happening. We find many activities. We find a history of postal trade. We find a history of forests. I mean, a history of forts, fort building, and developments in fort building technology, in which there is a syncretism of European and Indian traditions and technology. We find advances in cannon foundry making, cannon making, in which you have hybrid technology evolving, with Indians learning from the Europeans and the Europeans learning from India. In fact, when you look at Surat and you look at the shipbuilding activities indulged in by the East India Company in Surat and Bombay, in both the places, they in fact invite established old Parsi shipwright families to assist their own shipwrights to make ships for for the Indian Ocean region and beyond. There's a use of Indian timber. In fact, teak from the Western Ghats played a very important role in even the making of ships for the Royal Navy. Some of these ships lasted more than 100 years and they were very sturdily made. So this is a very rich area. This is a very, for both for military history, economic history, political history, which are all enmeshed and together in the early modern period. And if we get away from Eurocentrism and we get away from the frameworks imposed on Indian history by colonialist historians, imperialist historians, and even nationalist historians, there is a very rich field of supplies, victualling, ship design, the kind of sails being used, the number of ships, the kind of ships which were used, and so on and so forth. And also a history of the Indian seafaring people, in which the Lashkars, the Tindals, the Sirangs, the native petty officers played a very important role. And some amount of work has also been done on Lashkars who regularly sailed across the seas and even found themselves living in the slums of London. They could be found in Ireland. They could, and Lashkars were a motley crowd of, they could be a motley crowd of Malays, Bengalis, Malayalis, Muslims from the Konkan region, and people from the fishing and seafaring communities of the western coast. So the period 1500 to about 1800 is a very, very interesting period in Indian history. And there's a whole lot still remains to be discovered. Even the history of the Royal Indian Marine, the forerunner of which was called the Bombay Marine, which was also Christian, the Indian Navy, plenty of aspects of that also remain to be discovered and written about. So all told, a very, very interesting period of Indian history. But the first step is to, free oneself from the shackles of Eurocentrism and other anachronistic frameworks in which this history has been written for a very, very long time. So with that, I end my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Deshpande. I will start with some of my basic questions. Now, the three, navies, the indigenous navies that you mentioned, the Marathas, the Angres, the Siddhis, and the Kunjali Marakars of the Malabar. Interestingly, they are all on the west coast, and we don't get to see anything on the east coast. And why would that be the reason? The first thing that it hits me when I look at your presentation.
I think the answer to that lies is in the fact that the most important, trading centers during the mercantilist period are to be found on the western coast of India. The Europeans came to India for spices. The spices were grown mostly in South India and Western India. And, that's one thing. And, it's Calicut and it's Cochin, Calicut, places like Surat, places like, later on, which developed into Bombay, places like Karwar and other places, which are well established, old centers of trade, Honawar and so on and so forth like that. Later on, even Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali, actually, they developed. In fact, I forgot to mention that one of the most important, another important navy which used to do the rounds of this area and fight with the Marathas was the navy of Hyder Ali.
Okay.
So in the from the 1770s and 80s onwards, you have Maratha records which constantly refer to clashes taking place between the Maratha navy, I mean navy of the Peshwas, and what they call Gurab Haidari, which is basically Gurabs which were commanded by Hyder Ali. And Hyder Ali had a vision. Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan were two people whose vision about world history and whose understanding of European sea power and European land power is unmatched in the 18th century. In fact, no Indian prince of that period, no Indian king of that period can come close to their develop an understanding which comes even close to their understanding of the Europeans. Hyder Ali, for instance, in his letters used to write that it's very difficult to fight the British very difficult to fight the English because the English not only have troops in India, but if need be, the English can get troops from across the world to fight people here. Therefore, it was extremely important for all Indian powers to unite against the English. So the same thing, it's the same feeling and the same view was held by Tipu Sultan, who in fact planned, who had, I mean, he's a very rare military leader and political leader of that time who had developed a blueprint for an ocean-going navy.
Okay. Okay.
And this blueprint of, it was his farman, Tipu's farman. He had actually, there was an entire, almost like a blueprint, almost like a paper on what kind of, Tipu was a great planner, you see. He used to plan factories and various things and so on. Okay. So there is this farman which he issued, and there is he wanted to build an ocean-going blue water navy of more than 100 vessels, some of which would be built on European patterns and would have a large number of guns and so on. So he understood these things. When he sent his embassies to Egypt and Ottoman and so on, people actually reported back to him. They saw things on the seas and so on. And he was a very keen learner. But unfortunately for India, he was defeated by the English and he died in 1799. So, I mean, I forgot to add that history. There's a history of the Mysore Navy, a small history of the Mysore Navy can also be done by somebody who can access records, either in Mysore or in the India Office Library or other archives across the world. So I think on the western coast of India, you have most of the important trading centers and older trading centers also. And there are natural harbors, big natural harbors there, Bombay, Surat, and Calicut. I mean, those kinds of natural harbors are not to be found on the east coast of India. That could be one reason, but I'm sure there are other reasons as well. The volume of trade from the Arabian Sea side, from the western side, from the 17th, 18th century onwards, grows. It's exponential. Whereas Bay of Bengal is also a very important area for local trade. And Bay of Bengal is integrated into the trading regions of Malaysia and Indonesia and so on, where there's a lot of local trade and so on. But I think...
I guess, in a sense...
Of course, Madras did play an important role. It's not that you... in the Anglo-French rivalry, if you see the Anglo-French wars of the mid-18th century, there is naval action on the Coromandel coast also.
But only between the two colonial
major, yes. There is no naval power as such. There is no indigenous naval power in the... I mean, after the Cholas, you don't find any important indigenous naval power on the eastern coast of India. That's a fact.
No, which is really interesting, because on two counts, right? One is there must have certainly been, even post Chola Navy, there were certainly sea-based trade going on continuously of some form, right? Which meant that there was probably a kind of threat from the pirates, if not from a colonial power. What happened with the Portuguese is a very distinctly different model, but there would have been certainly pirates, and somebody was needed to drive the pirates away, to provide protection to your own force. Somehow, even the point that you made about the Mughals leaving the protection of the Hajj pilgrims to the Siddhis and not themselves wanting to build a powerful navy. Forget about colonizing other places. At least to protect your own extension of your land into the Arabian Sea. That is very surprising. But equally, when during the emergence of the Vijayanagara kingdom, they can very clearly see that the Portuguese are coming. Portuguese are selling them horses. They see that, but the attempt to match that somehow seems to have not been there, which is very surprising to me. Your views on this, sir?
You see, number one, the Vijayanagar Empire, it was there in the 16th century. And the Portuguese used to regularly visit their ports. The Portuguese used to regularly go to the court. They were horse traders to get horses. And, there are Malay records and there are Vijayanagar records, and there are records of, many traders and, and so on. But Vijayanagar was a place to which everybody came. It was a great trading center. And the Vijayanagar kings had made special arrangements for workshops to be set up in the capital. In fact, their cities were well known in many parts of the world. In fact, Malaysians and, as I said, Southeast Asians used to visit regularly Vijayanagar, and they have left behind rich accounts. Malay travelers have left behind rich accounts of, Vijayanagara, as they used to call it. But no, Vijayanagar does not emerge as a major naval power at that time. As I have said, it's a question of historical need also. And the historical need, as far as the Europeans were concerned, they had greater historical need for developing an ocean-going navy, simply because they traded across the seas. And they brought bullion from, let's say, the Spaniards brought bullion all the way from South America, which is, from Chile and from Peru and from other parts, and commodities and so on.
Right.
So in that transatlantic trade, they needed the navy. And when the Spaniards started importing bullion in convoys, the British, who actually began as pirates, people like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh, were basically glorified pirates. And they keep calling other people pirates, but they used to indulge in piracy all the time, because their favorite pastime was to prey on Spanish shipping.
Right.
And finally to put an end to all this Spanish planned an Armada attack on Great Britain in 1588, and the Armada was sunk, and the Tudors defeated the Spaniards and so on, as you know very well. So much of this bullion is to come into Europe, and then from Europe this bullion would come back to India, and that's what created the great prosperity of India in the 17th and the 18th centuries.
True.
And bullion imports into India ceased only after 1757. Till 1757, governments constantly have to, against their will, sanction governments and banks and traders, keep sanctioning the export of bullion from, and so to protect this bullion and to protect the ships which used to take Indian commodities back, in the context of the intense rivalry which developed between the European powers, who were, seaborne. These are powers which depend on sea power. So on the other hand, powers in Asia are largely land-based powers. We talk of Shiva, of Shivaji's navy, for instance. But after Shivaji's death, nobody really takes a great amount of interest in developing the navy. It's only the initiative of Kanoji Angre. He's a very, very interesting, fascinating character, and I've written about him, and I've sent you the photographs of the book. You can actually show those photographs to the people who are with us, the entire, the book is called The Rise and Fall of a Brown Water Navy, Kanoji Angre and, and Maratha Sea Power on the western coast of India. It was published by Akar in 2021, which is about a year before, about 2 years ago almost. So I've actually sketched out Kanoji Angre's character very well in that book.
Okay.
Who is this man? Why is he so interested in developing naval power? And how skillfully he uses that naval power it was a wonderful account. Not only Kanoji Angre, his son later on Sekhoji Angre, and then his other son, finally the recalcitrant son, the refractory son who refused to surrender, Tulaji Angre, who was taken prisoner by. In fact, it's against Kanoji Angre that Robert Clive gets his first major command. So Clive is known for Plassey, but very few people know that Clive played the first important role, military role against the Angres in alliance with the Peshwas in 1756. Clive had just returned from a furlough to England, and he was in Bombay when the expedition against Vijay was planned by the East India Company in Bombay, and they said they put Clive immediately in charge of this. So Clive and Watson, they played a very, very important role in this battle for Ghedia, which took place in 1756, almost a year before Plassey. So Clive actually learned a lot of lessons in the way Ghedia, which is which was the local name for the stronghold of Vijay, which was captured by Clive and Watson, and Clive stayed there for more than a week. The English thoroughly plundered the place. They took away all the cash, took away the entire treasury, and so on. They violated the treaty the Peshwa had signed with them in 1755. The Peshwa received nothing, not even a single penny from the English. The only thing the Peshwa received was the custody of Tulaji Angre, who was who the Peshwa feared so much and who was so powerful that he had to be shifted from jail to jail till 1786. In fact, he lived 30 years after the fall of Ghedia.
Okay.
But the other part of the family, Manaji Angre, actually surrendered to the English, and he became a basically a kind of prince under the protection of the English and so on. And it's his, I think it's his, successors who ultimately also played an important role as the Sardar Angres of Gwalior later on. So, you have, it's a very, very interesting story. I mean, very interesting story. And I mean, European sea power could triumph in India only because the land-based power in India, themselves brought down these brown water navies.
Right.
Had they supported these navies, but then that feeling was not there, so you can't really blame them for that. Then again, you will be giving into that kind of nationalist anachronism and so on. And this is something which Apte keeps asking this in his book. He says, I don't understand why Nana Sahib had to enter into a treaty with the English against Angre. But then, Nana Sahib did not think like Apte did. So, it's a very, that's a different time.
Absolutely. Yeah. There are a few questions. Let me quickly ask them. There's a question from Kishore. Do we have the works of history written by the pirates in quotes? For example, do we have a work written by Maraccas about themselves? A sort of a autobiographical account or somebody writing about them from within that community?
I have not seen such works. Had there been a work of that kind, a translation would have been available. But I guess these quote-unquote pirates were so busy fighting all the time that they had no time to sit in a library and write.
True, but at least somebody in that extended group who's closely following it could have possibly written it. I mean, that's in a sense.
I would myself love to be enlightened about this. Frankly speaking, I cannot. I mean, the Angles did not write at all, so we don't know what they thought.
So
that part is silent.
Yeah. So the British account of the Angres is what we actually get.
We have very rich accounts by the. I mean, you have the Bombay factory records also.
Yeah. So
these factory records tell us that they are paranoid about Angria. And all the Marathas are referred to as Shivajis.
Okay.
Shivajis is the generic term for the
generic
Marathas.
term. Okay. So it's exactly like how they accounted for what is happening in the Tamil region. What they call as polygars. The Palayakaras, a whole bunch of. Everybody is generally put under one polygar, and an account of them only exists from the British records.
Yeah, and they are all generally refractory and not willing to surrender, and resisting civilization and so on and so forth and all that. So it's Angria's. I mean, I've gone through these factory records. I've gone through these. When I was working on many years ago. In 1992, I published my first paper in the EPW on Kanoji Angre. In fact, in that paper, I have mentioned. That paper is on limitations of Western technology on the Arabian Sea.
Right.
And in that paper, I examined 3 very important botched up, disastrous expeditions launched by the English in alliance with the Portuguese sometimes against the Angre strongholds.
Okay.
And there were British accounts who said, we used to take a shy at him and always, come out the worse for it, because you have. I would say this Angre is I would say he's carrying out a very important sea-based naval guerrilla war against a very powerful commercial company.
Okay.
And resisting the East India Company with all its resources and with a powerful navy and with the help of the Royal Navy, because the Royal Navy used to stand. When the East India Company Marine used to go into action against Angre, the Royal Navy used to be, they could approach the shallows, but from behind, let's say about 5 kilometers, 3 kilometers, 2 kilometers, 1.5 kilometers, they would be bombarding the ports all the time.
Okay.
So this is a Navy supported, this grab service is supported by the Royal Navy.
Right.
And it's distributing rum and biscuits liberally to its soldiers to fight this accursed Angria, and there are constantly the records keep talking. They're paranoid of Angria and they can't sleep because of Angria, because Angria is raiding them. Angria is issuing dastaks. Angria is confiscating his ships. In Tulaji Angre, in fact, he was even more feared than Kanoji Angre, because he used to just make a prize of European ships right, left, and center, and often they would take European sailors as hostages. They would take European supported merchants as hostages, keep them for days in their forests, and these ransoms would be paid. So much of this was going on: hostage taking, paying of ransom, and so on. Both sides trying to understand each other, interdicting each other. The Portuguese following their cartas system, and Kanoji Angre then instituting a dastak system.
Right.
So they are all using similar tactics, and this goes on for about 60-70 years. And after that, many of these, I suspect much of this degenerates into local level piracy. So Maratha records are replete with this references to Maratha ships fighting pirates very close to Surat and various other places, and Basan and so on. So the pirates were very bold. They could actually come very close to these strongholds and even make a prize of other ships. So this is a very interesting period from the 1670s, 80s, 1670s, 80s till about 1750s and 60s. So
yeah, there's a question which I think you already answered, but anyway, I'll ask again. Srikanth Kesnur wants to know, did the Adil Shahis of the Bijapur or the Vijayanagars have any navy or coastal constabulary force? So if not navy, at least some kind of a coastal force.
Adil Shahis used to own many of the ports. I mean, they were rulers of many of the ports. The Adil Shahis are basically, after the demise of Vijayanagar, it's the Adil Shahi Sultanate which plays the most important role. And their center is at Bijapur, but they control a large part of the Canara and Konkan coast, southern Konkan and northern Kerala coast. Many of the ports are in the Adil Shahi hands, but we don't find, we don't find the Adil Shahis developing a navy.
Okay.
In fact, they also remained largely land-based. In fact, most of the Indian powers were land-based. If you look at Shivaji also, Sen points out in the military system of the Marathas, he says, Sen and both Kulkarni also in his works have pointed out that, contrary to what the nationalists would have us believe, the Navy was very minor to Shivaji's overall military expenditure. We have records of that, and a very small part of the budget was sanctioned for the Navy.
Okay.
I think Shivaji, it is said, there is legend that Shivaji personally played a very important role in building ships, and he also stayed for a while near Suvarnadurg and other places. But I think from the 1670s, late 1660s, 70s onwards, Shivaji became more focused on land, on his campaigns against the Adil Shahis and later on the Mughal governors and so on. And then, of course, he was besieged by the large Mughal forces sent into the Deccan under Jai Singh. And then he was actually a Chhatrapati only for 6 years. His coronation took place in 1674. And I think he died barely at the age of 50 in 1680. And then the Peshwas really did not take the Navy seriously. In fact, the Maratha Navy became, it became an insignificant player on the western coast of India. And by the time the Peshwas became, by the time the Battle of Panipat took place, and by the time the Peshwas from the 1730s and 40s became more, they concentrated their attention more on the expansion of Maratha power into central and northern India in search of revenue. And in fact, they considered the Angre family a thorn in their side, a distraction. So that's why they, I think, to put an end to the Angres once and for all, they aligned with the British in 1755 and brought down Tulaji Angre, who just wouldn't listen to anybody. I mean, he was so powerful, and in fact, when the English sent him an ultimatum, he wrote back a letter, and the letter is. I wish I had my book in front of me. I would have actually quoted from that letter. He actually told them very clearly that I'm not going to surrender, and I'm standing up for war. And if you really want to, go ahead. You're most welcome to fight, and we'll give you a good fight. You have a good fight on your hands. We'll give you a good fight.
Okay.
So you have these dynamics have to be understood, but this can only be understood when you move history out of certain frameworks.
Correct. Got it. One last question from Ishan Harit. He wants to know, on the eastern side, did guilds and monastic institutions play a significant role in organizing protection in the Bay of Bengal? How dense was the trade?
I mean, frankly speaking, I'm not a great expert on I'm not an expert in these affairs at all. But the Bay of Bengal remains absolutely dark space for me. I mean, I don't really know much about, except for the fact that there is a big trading center called Masulipatam, which is called Machilipattam. There is Madras, and of course there were the Arakanese pirates who used to harass ships, who used to harass ships around Chittagong and so on. And there were Mughal warships. I mean, we have some record of Mughal warships in Chittagong. Chittagong was a major Mughal port, you see. Like Surat on the western coast, Chittagong was the major port. Calcutta developed much later under British control. But Hooghly and Chittagong is the major port. Chittagong is the major port. And it is from Chittagong that they approach both Assam, Burma, as well as the Bay of Bengal, which is, it had a commanding presence. And it is said that, in Child's War, which took place, I think, in 1685, I forget the date, in which, the year in which the East India Company declared a war on Aurangzeb with the intention of capturing a large amount of land and, large amount of waterine space in Bengal.
Right.
But then these people were beaten black and blue by the Mughals.
Yes. Yes.
In fact, Aurangzeb was the first ruler of India who inflicted a crushing defeat on the English East India Company in the late 17th century. So if you really want to make a list of all those people who are, whom you would like to categorize as freedom fighters because they fought the English, then I think Aurangzeb's name would be on the top of that list.
Yeah.
And then the English apologized, and they were about to be thrown out completely from India. So they apologized and they groveled in front of him, and finally in fact, money was taken from them apparently, and their stations were restored to them. But there is news of, there is some information about Mughal warships in this region.
Okay.
But we don't know much about the nature of these warships, whether they carried guns or what guns. I'm sure they were there on the Brahmaputra and other places, but and Chittagong and the areas around that to protect some trade. But what was the nature of their? Because if you look at the Straits of Malacca, it's infested with pirates. And till the 20th century, the Malaccan pirates are very famous. There's piracy even now sometimes around Borneo, Sumatra, and so on. And of course, the Red Sea remains a heaven of pirates. Even now, even in the medieval period, you have references to Somali pirates.
Yeah.
So Somali pirates also have a very long history.
Been very, very famous. Yeah.
Omani pirates, Somali pirates. Yes, Somali pirates. The Somalis were, very, very intrepid seafaring people.
Right.
If you just don't look at them as pirates, but as enterprising seafarers who are actually trying to milk the trade in their region,
right.
You come up with very interesting. And there were, in Madagascar. In fact, Madagascar developed as a major center for piracy. In fact, you have, there was a pirate republic which was established with rules and regulations and their own system in Madagascar for a short while in the medieval period. So these are very interesting stories, like the Caribbean and so on. Very interesting story. And there are some very good Netflix serials on these things if you want to watch them. They've really done good research, and of course, it costs a lot of money to do these things, but and so on. So some Indian filmmakers can take clues from these things and maybe make something, less Bollywood-like and more professional about these people.
Yeah. Thank you. I would like to share the cover of your book, which. So this
that's the book. It's jointly written by me and my former PhD student Mufid Mujawar, who now works at the Distance Education Center at the Kolhapur University, Shivaji University, Kolhapur. He's my PhD student. And you can show the back of the book also. You have a back.
I've just pulled the front alone, and I'm just showing only the image.
Yeah, it's not a very big book. It's in the 4.5 inch, 6-7 inch format, meant for the public in general. But it's based on. I think we have carried out a fairly rigorous research into the primary and secondary sources of this entire important navy, 18th and 19th, 17th and 18th centuries. Sarkhel Kanunji Angre, Rise and Fall of the Brown Water Navy. So, and it's doing very well. It's into its third print, so people are buying it, and it's actually in America and UK and many European countries. This has done very well, and people are actually orders are being placed even today. So I'm very happy that the book has done well. So
wonderful topic.
It's very reasonably priced for students and people in general.
Okay.
It's not. It has no verbiage. It is completely shorn of jargon and all those things, which which usually academic history is full of. So.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I would love to see you read this and give me your remarks.
Yes. I've already passed it, and I will read the book and get back to you.
I can see Kishore smiling. Kishore can also read it if he feels like.
Sure.
Yes. Yeah. We'll do that. Over to Kishore. Thank you, Professor, for an excellent talk, and over to Kishore to round up the day's proceedings.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Anirudh Deshpande. And a very nice lecture and followed by a lively interaction. Thank you, Badri, as well. With that, we end today's program. Tomorrow is the 5th day, and we have 2 interesting lectures. The first one is on the spread of Sanskritic Buddhism by sea by Dr. Andrea. Our first speaker referred to Dr. Andrea and his work and the joint work that they did today. So he is going to be speaking first tomorrow, and then at 7 p.m. we're going to look at the eastern coast. We had lectures on the Kutch traders on the coast of Gujarat and also on Malabar. This time we're going to go eastwards, and there is a lecture by Dr. Rila Mukherjee on the maritime worlds of East Coast India, with particular focus on Bengal, Orissa, and the Andhra coast. The same schedule as today, starts at 5:30, should end at around 8:30 p.m. All our videos of our previous day's programs, in case you missed it, please go to YouTube, watch them at our YouTube channel, Tamil Heritage Trust. You can watch our previous programs, and you also find links to our next 3 days program. Thank you very much. And
thank you.